All right, good afternoon and good morning, everybody. We got 62 people watching now. Special, special broadcast today with Dr. Paul Saladino. We're going to be talking about the carnivore diet, the myths, the misconceptions, the deceptions around carnivory. And we're going to talk all about how to do it right. And we're going to hear the perspective of a really well-informed individual. You may know him from smashing PhD, Dr. Lane Norton, PhD, in a fascinating debate. I'm just playing, Lane. I'm sure you're a nice guy, man. I'd give you a hard time. But yeah, that was a great debate. A lot of us in the carnivorous community really appreciate that one. But how's it going, Dr. Paul Saladino?
Man, it's good to be here. I'm stoked. I'm stoked to be talking to you. We got some fun stuff to talk about. It's it's a morning here. It's 9 a.m. here in Seattle, and yeah, I'm excited to share with folks.
Right, 9 a.m. in Seattle. It's 12:10 over here in the Andes of Ecuador, and we're talking from all the way around the world, to people all around the world, about something that none of us would have ever expected maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Who would have thought that you and I would be sitting here talking about how we're not eating any plants at all, eating a completely animal food-based diet?
Dude, it's crazy. It's a wild thing, and I've been continually impressed and blown away by how many people respond positively to this and the rate at which the movement is growing. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's valuable for some people. Yeah, it's an incredible movement, man. It's happening for real, and it's a wild thing. I never thought that I'd be here. I mean,
Yeah.
2 years ago, I was just at the beginning of my residency, and I mean, I don't know. I can tell you the story if you want to hear it of how I got interested in it.
Absolutely, man. Let's start from the beginning. Let's get the origin story of Dr. Paul Saladino. I mean, it seems like you were blessed with a name that could have brought you real far in the whole plant-based YouTube community, man. What's up with that, man? We got some people in the chat. They think you're like a vegan infiltrator, trying to spread salad all over everyone.
No, man. No, it's just Italian. So it's the Italian roots. My father's father is from Palermo. My father's mother is from Memphis. They're both from Sicily, so I'm Sicilian, mostly Italian, and it's just that the roots are Italian, and so that's the Saladino. And I think it may mean small salad in Italian, although I haven't had that confirmed. So,
Yeah.
so anyway, but yeah, I mean, my dad's a doc. I grew up thinking about food a lot, and I grew up thinking about medicine. I grew up thinking about health, and I grew up, first I was a mathlete, in high school. I was pretty nerdy. And then once I got out of high school and into college, I started becoming more of an athlete. And I was always interested in the way that my body reacted to the foods that I was eating. And I had my meanderings, and my journey has been circuitous. I had a vegan phase, like many of us probably did. I think that.
How long was that vegan phase?
It was 8 months. 8 months. It was a raw vegan phase, actually. I don't mess
Guilty
around.
as charged also, man. I played with it as well. I dabbled. I wasn't ever fully sold on it, so it was always like, I had a little bit of fish and my brain turned on, and it was like something is right with the animal foods, but maybe I don't need so much of them. Maybe the plants are better. Need a little bit of the animal foods just so I don't die. It's crazy.
Man, it was 13, 14 years ago, so it was actually when I was working as a physician assistant. So the whole story, or going back, is that I've always been interested in food. I've always been interested in how it influenced my body and how it's affected the way that I performed, whether it was running. I started out as a runner. I was never very fast, so I got into like ultra running, and I did some ultras. At one point, I thru hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, which was a really cool experience.
How long is an ultra? How long is an ultra? Just for the audience who hasn't heard of
An
it.
ultra is just anything that's longer than a marathon. So an ultra is anything longer than 26.2. So most of the races I did were 36 or 50 miles. That was it. I never got into the 100-mile range, but I did a number of 50-mile races and 36-mile races, mostly in the wilderness.
Dude,
in the woods. I just like running.
I can't relate to wanting to do a 30-mile race. I grew up asthmatic, and like my nose is just now opening up as an adult man, 32 years old. I'm finally able to breathe through my nose. But yeah, that sounds brutal.
I grew up asthmatic too, man. So my dad was a doc, and I got fed theophylline and albuterol as a kid all the time. I hated it, man. I was an over-medicated kid. I grew up asthmatic in Northern Virginia, eating dairy and all kinds of shit that probably affected who I was as a human. And of course, for me, you know, it's the same, like I don't have any problems with asthma or reactive airway disease at all now. But yeah, so food was always interesting to me. After college, I was a ski bum and just traveled and was seeing the world and didn't think as much about food, but thought about just adventuring and exploring.
So you were working at ski resorts?
I did work at ski resorts. I worked in restaurants. I waited tables.
Yeah.
Yep. And I was a ski bum. I found skiing in my early 20s. After I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, I discovered skiing and got into backcountry skiing. And man, skiing powder is a pretty addictive experience for anyone that's done that. And being in the mountains, as you know, is just, there's something spiritual about that. So
it's pretty amazing.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah, skiing, snowboarding as well. It's pretty incredible. I skied as a kid a little bit, and then I snowboarded a bit during college. But yeah, some of my best road trips in my life were up to Tahoe and just powder, deep powder after storms that were just really intense, and I love it.
Yeah, man, it's something happens with your mind. I mean, that's the flow state. You just lose yourself in the moment, and it's incredible. Surfing is the same way for me now. But after about 6 years of skiing and traveling and exploring, I decided to go back to PA school. So I went to physician assistant school thinking, my dad's a doc. He was a martyr. He worked his ass off. I never saw him enough growing up. So I wanted to do something that was in the middle. I liked biology. I wasn't thinking about food yet, but I went to PA school at George Washington University in DC, and then moved out to Oregon to work with some cardiologists that I knew, and worked in cardiology as a PA for 4 years. And that was when I started running ultras. And that was when I started thinking more about food. And the first kind of foray I went down the road was the David Wolfe propaganda Pied Piper thing, you know,
Sun Food Diet Success book.
Yeah, like,
dude, he's still around. He's still around talking about chocolate is the octave of the sun and all this shit.
Oh my God, dude, that guy, man. Maybe I'll meet him someday and get to do some jujitsu with him and put him in the guillotine that he deserves to be put in, or something, like, for spreading that garbage. But I guess he thinks he's doing the right thing. So whatever, I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? He's monetized it really well, I guess. You know, you got to give him some credit for his marketing skills, I guess.
Yeah. So I think that there is something interesting to note about that, though, and that was that I was working as a PA, and what I saw pretty quickly being in medicine as a physician assistant many years ago was that Western medicine doesn't really work to fix disease. And I think that was pretty quickly the first sort of, existential crisis I had with my career was, oh shit, I went to PA school, I work as a physician assistant in cardiology, and the beta blockers, the statins, the meds I give people don't actually fix the root cause, and most of them just progress. And medicine isn't very good or motivated to ask what is actually causing a problem, whether it's atherosclerosis, which is the formation of plaque in the arteries, whether it's hypertension, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's a stroke, whether it's lupus, whether it's autoimmune thyroid disease. Western medicine was founded on the principle, medicine in general is founded on the principle that we should understand what causes something, but I would say that Western medicine has gotten too far from that. We just don't do that enough.
You're so nice about it.
I'm so nice.
You're so gentle with them. Man, as somebody who grew up with asthma, I totally relate. And I think I was kind of cynical about it by the age of like 12, 13, where it was like, well, I have an asthma attack, and what do? You tell me to take more albuterol. I go to a doctor. What do? You tell me to blow into a thing. See how hard I can blow.
Right.
There was no real treatment of lifestyle. In fact, my doctor, we did an allergy test, and we had cats. And he told I loved those cats too. I loved them so much. He told me, you got to get rid of these cats, man. You're highly allergic to these cats. That was the only useful advice we ever got. And we didn't follow up on it.
At least it was a little bit of lifestyle advice, right? But yeah. Well, the thing is this, being in medicine now, being in residency, having gone to medical school, I will say this. Almost everybody I know in medicine is super intelligent and really well-intentioned and is drinking the Kool-Aid. Yeah. And it's not the fault of all the other doctors that they were fed Kool-Aid. In my opinion, it's not the fault of individual physicians who are all super intelligent, well-meaning individuals who have worked their asses off to be where they are in medicine. It's the fact that the overall teaching paradigm in medicine is not aimed at the root cause of an illness. Like I respect my colleagues in medicine greatly because I've been through it. I've been in the trenches with them. And, people will say like, oh, doctors just go to medical school to make money. That's bullshit. Like, doctors generally go to medical school because they like what they're doing. And there are much easier ways to make a lot of money than medical school. Like working 36 hours in a row. I mean, like the people I went to medical school with and residency with, we all bleed for this. Nobody is in this for money. Well, that's not true. Some people are. Mostly everyone is in this because they enjoy it and they want to help people. And that sounds passé, but that's why I'm not overly critical of the individuals in medicine, but it's the system and the paradigm that bothers me. The idea that somehow, whether it's pharmaceutical companies, or whatever, the paradigm in medicine needs to change, and it needs to be shifted more toward what is causing the illness. The people in medicine are amazing. It's just we're not thinking about it properly.
No, it's like everything. People are great. People are awesome, but we get duped into doing stupid shit, killing each other, stealing from each other, rape and murder. People are pretty amazing, but we just we kind of get fooled into doing some nonsense sometimes.
We do get fooled, and medical school is a foolery, man. Like we get fooled in medical school, and we're taught. We're sort of taught the biochemistry, and we're taught like this may be what causes this, but then it gets brushed aside, and there's absolutely no association with nutrition or attention to nutrition in medical school. There's no attention to nutrition in residency, and that to me is a great travesty. So I was working as a PA, and I was like, man, I can't affect this disease. I discovered functional medicine. I had my foray into raw vegan world and lost 25 pounds and was super skinny, and then eventually
25 pounds of muscle lost.
25 pounds of lean metabolic muscle that actually works to do everything good in my body. Yeah. Not fat. No, I was not obese at that time in my life. I lost 25 pounds of muscle. I was clearly malnourished. And I eventually, discovered functional medicine, and just this idea. What I like about functional medicine is it's the fact that it's root cause medicine, and people can criticize functional medicine, and functional medicine kind of gets a bad rap because there's a variety of people within functional medicine doing a variety of things. And I like the idea of root cause medicine. That's what I'm about. And whether we call that functional medicine or integrative medicine or good medicine, period, or Western medicine, whatever, like I just want to understand the root of an illness rather than ameliorating symptoms.
So you decided, like, you got an MD. You decided instead of going into traditional practice, working at Kaiser Permanente or something like that, you went a very different route. Let's flesh out the functional medicine thing a little bit. I mean, we probably got some people in the audience, or maybe people that are following you that aren't so sure what it even means, functional medicine. I think a lot of people have heard it, but they're not so familiar with it. So what is the principle?
Basically, it's just root cause medicine is how I would define functional medicine. It is medicine, it is thought aimed at understanding the root cause of an illness. And that root cause can be a variety of things. It can be biochemistry, it can be the interaction of genetics and environment, it can be stressful environment, it can be spiritual corruption. People are living in lives that are not fulfilling. It can be environmental toxins, it can be all kinds of things. But the question gets asked at the beginning, what is causing this illness, rather than how do we treat this illness? How do we ameliorate the symptoms? That's all functional medicine is. And I think that there probably needs to be some evolution of the verbiage. I'm not sure the word functional medicine is the best word, whatever. But when people say functional medicine, it is a doctor or a clinician who is just thinking about the root cause of an illness. And people do that in different ways. I may not agree with everything every functional medicine doctor does. And I would venture to say that 99% of functional medicine doctors in the world will tell you to eat a shitload of vegetables, which actually we'll talk about, I disagree with. So within the functional medicine community, I may become a bit of a pariah, which I am fully okay with, but we are all thinking about the same thing. We all want the same thing. We just may achieve it in different ways. I don't think eating a bunch of vegetables is a good idea.
That's a good way.
So that's what functional medicine is. And yeah, I went back to medical school. So I was working as a PA in cardiology. I had an interest in atherosclerosis, and I thought, I have to go back to medical school. I need to get a doctorate. I need to have full autonomy to really push this work forward. And at that time, I'd stopped being a vegan. I was more like paleo. And pretty much throughout medical school, I thought a lot about food. That's always been my interest, is nutrition and food and how it shapes who we are as humans. I knew that was the key. And I first heard a lecture from Georgia Ede, who I've not connected with yet, but I'm a big fan of.
Likewise. Shout out to Georgia Ede. We're both looking for you, Georgia. Come hang out.
I'll reach out to her soon. So, I heard a lecture from her from the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2014 was when I heard maybe it was 2012. It was one of the first AHSs because I was in medical school from 2011 to 2015. And her lecture was about, she's a psychiatrist. So her lecture was about things she had observed clinically with vegetables affecting people's mental states. And it was sort of a radical departure from everything I'd heard to that point, which was polyphenols are amazing. Vegetables are the best thing in the world. Fiber, fiber, fiber. If, 300 grams of fiber is better than 200 grams of fiber a day. And, onions are going to save
Can you
the
imagine
world.
eating 200 grams of fiber a day right now?
I probably did it when I was a vegan, and the results were an insane amount of gas. Nobody wanted to be around me. And the biggest green poops you've ever seen on every single run.
Oh man,
it was just ridiculous. So
it's like a rumen poop with you when you do that much fiber, right? It's like you know how a cow, it's walking along and it just kind of slides out, like it doesn't bend over like a dog and squeeze it. It just kind of falls out. That's the standard raw vegan poop, I think.
I mean, it looked the same going in as it did coming out. It was just like green smoothie in, green smoothie out. It was crazy.
Pooped a papaya.
It was nuts.
A whole papaya.
So it was just crazy. But anyway, that lecture really got me thinking about things. That was in my first year of medical school, so it must have been 2011 or 2012. And I came up with this adage then that my friends kind of joked with me about. I was like, I think we should just be eating all the things that start with F: fungus, fruit, and things with faces, which is like the anti-vegan movement. Vegans say, I don't eat anything with a face. And I was saying, eat everything with a face. Like, faces, fungus, and fruit was what I thought. Maybe that's what we should eat: faces, fungus, and fruit, because they have less anti-nutrients. That was in 2012. So I was thinking about it, like maybe even in that point, I was thinking, man, the roots, stems, and leaves of plants, especially the seeds too, are full of all these anti-nutrients and toxins, which we should definitely get into.
There's
today.
A few that seem less. Now, just in defense of carrots, right? Like, I don't feel weird about feeding my kids carrots. Like, it seems like there are certain roots that are pretty well handled, and there's other ones which is, what the hell are you eating that many potatoes for, right?
Exactly. I'm going to be hanging out with Ben Greenfield tonight and tomorrow. And I was researching some stuff to hang out with him. And I was looking at tubers because we were talking, and he was like, I want to know about tubers. Don't indigenous people eat tubers? And we can go down this rabbit hole later, but I was looking at tubers, and there are some tubers like cassava, which are fucking toxic as shit, and there's some like sweet potato, which maybe are not as toxic. They maybe don't have a whole lot of redeeming value, but they might be the kind of thing that if you came across in a famine, you'd be like, yeah, I will eat a sweet potato, Yeah. And carrots might be in that same vein. And it's so interesting because this journey for me has really been about, so I feel a little overwhelmed sometimes. I'm a doctor, and then I'm also challenged to be an ethnobotanist and a botanist and a zoologist, which I'm not, or an anthropologist.
Anthropology comes into play, like all this
and
stuff.
I'm just like, wow, I love it. I love the learning. I do the best I can to merge it. But technically my training is as a physician. Anyway, so I'm trying to learn about all these plant species and the glycolytic, the cyanogenic glycosides and cassava and other tubers. And, what about sweet potato? Does that have any toxins in it? Anyway, so yeah, carrots are probably pretty benign. We can talk about, net benefit, but yeah, it's an interesting thing. So not all plants are as toxic as others, but the idea that plants are toxic and plants could trigger disease in humans is a radical concept, because the mainstream party line in functional medicine is kale is the best thing ever. There are other psychiatrists in the world. There are other physicians in the functional medicine space who say the tagline is food and mood. And most people in that space will say, eat a big green salad, with
spinach,
a lot of kale.
Baby spinach, raw spinach.
Spinach, all the oxalates, which they don't even talk about. Anyway, so yeah, kale is amazing. And it's actually kale is toxic as hell. And we will talk about why. But in 2012, I didn't realize I was thinking that, and I cut out some of those things from my diet. I probably felt a little better. And then I didn't think about it again for a while. I kind of went back to it, and I had to finish medical school and apply to residency. But functional medicine was always in my mind. And I knew in medical school that I wanted to do functional medicine. I wanted to do root cause medicine. And then at the end of medical school, so I graduated from the University of Arizona, which is in Tucson, with an MD in 2015. And I've been at the University of Washington in Seattle doing a 4-year residency for the last 3 and almost 4 years. So I've got 3 months left in my residency. I'm finishing residency in 3 months. And the residency that I chose to do was in psychiatry. You there? Oh, I lost you.
Sorry, I was muted, man. I do that all the time. You're not even out of your residency, and look how naughty you already are.
I know.
What's going to happen when they let you off that chain?
I'm pretty much already off that chain. It's like, I was talking to a buddy last night. He was like, why even do residency? I was like, man, I'm going to finish residency. But at this point, yeah. Anyway, so I decided to do residency in psychiatry because when I finished toward the end of medical school, I got interested in story and narrative and the human side of medicine. And I liked that psychiatry had human story and narrative in it, and that it sort of started with this idea of who someone is and what's meaningful to them and their narrative. And, honestly, like seeing patients in a psychiatric setting is really meaningful to me as a person because people come in with really poignant concerns, depression, anxiety. These cut to the core of like who we are as a person. And I would argue that this is something I've talked about on other podcasts that people have heard me talk, is that many psychiatric diseases are autoimmune in nature. So everything in medicine is the same. Like, I think medical specialties are a bullshit concept in general. The fact that like I'm a psychiatrist, so I see someone with depression, and this guy's an endocrinologist, so he sees someone with a thyroid issue, is total crap because thyroid can cause a psychiatric issue. So as a psychiatrist, I see myself as a physician first, and not necessarily as a psychiatrist. And I have to think about everything with my patient. Somebody comes to see me in my residency and they have depression. I have to think, do they have inflammation? Do they have neuroinflammation? Do they have a thyroid issue? Do they have autoimmunity? Do they have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Yeah. Do they have micronutrient deficiency? Do they have genetic polymorphisms? Do they have folate cycle disorders? So like, I'm not just thinking, there's no way that as a psychiatrist, I can live in this box of someone's brain. That is ridiculous, And no physician should have that luxury. When I was a PA in cardiology, they'd always say, right here, this is where you need to think, the heart box. Actually, it's over here. Anyway.
Nothing to do with anything else going on in your life. Nothing to do with any environmental factors. Just that's the window that you can look in.
That's the window. Think about their heart. Don't think about their thyroid. Don't think about their gut. Don't think about their brain. And so that is really the juxtaposition that I will make for people with functional medicine versus Western medicine, is that as a functional medicine doctor or a doctor who believes in functional medicine as a concept, I'm going to think about how everything is connected in the whole body, whether I went to residency in psychiatry or internal medicine or did a fellowship in gastroenterology or am a dermatologist. Whatever I've done, I'm thinking about how it's all connected, because it is, right? And that's how patients get good care. The balkanization of medicine is bad care for patients. And so though I'm formally trained in psychiatry and I will be board certified in psychiatry, I will think about all my patients and clients as, a holistic being. And no single person that comes to see me is not going to get their gut, their thyroid, everything evaluated. And probably what I'll end up doing is treating people who have all sorts of things because of that. But that's how a functional medicine doc thinks. It's all connected.
Yeah. Well, I did not realize that there were functional medicine doctors in psychiatry. I didn't realize that this was even happening. Are you one of the few? Or how many other?
I might be one of the only ones, man. I might be one of the only ones.
So you're trailblazing it, man. That's good.
Yeah, I don't actually even think of myself as a psychiatrist. I think of myself as a physician, because that's the whole carnivore thing, It's just like, I am interested in helping people understand how to live their best life and how to be free from illness. And that can be somebody who comes to me with depression, or they can come to me with gas and bloating and pain and constipation. And you know what? Those can be caused by the same things.
Yeah, right.
And so,
well, your gas and your bloating and your constipation can make you depressed because you're in the freaking toilet all the time.
Or they can cause neuroinflammation. So, you can say, oh, maybe you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which I would argue is an autoimmune issue. And, that can activate the immune system around the gut in the lamina propria, which can transit throughout the body. The cytokines can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause neuroinflammation and activation of the microglia in the brain. So this is functional medicine. That right there is functional medicine. The idea that, like, as a physician, like, we cannot think about someone in terms of an organ system. So,
well, and many of our neurotransmitters are actually created through bacteria, right? They're actually created in our gut.
They are.
Speaking of which, have you tried high meat?
Man, I want to. I've never tried. Have you tried high meat?
Yeah, make some. It's so easy, dude. Hey, well, I'll send you a copy of our book. And there's a recipe. It's basically you cut up some liver, you put it in a jar halfway full, you open up the jar every few days, you wait a few months, you'll smell it every once in a while. One day you'll get the guts to eat some. After a couple of months, it actually gets really, really good. And we're talking about neurochemistry. We're talking about the connection between the gut and the brain. There's something that can demonstrate to you in one bite. The first bite I took, it made me laugh. It was I'd never taken a bite of food, and it's like, it made me laugh. It was it turns something on in your brain. There are, like you said, the neurotransmitters that are created by bacteria. So I think high meat's an interesting kind of window into that world.
And people have probably heard me talk about this, but the majority of the immune system surrounds the gut. So, this is an interesting concept. The idea that we can affect the body profoundly with microgram or milligram doses of medications, and we take in kilogram quantities of food. So for people, that may not be familiar with the metric system, those are orders of magnitude, so a microgram to a kilogram is multiple orders of magnitude. A milligram to a kilogram, we're talking 10,000 times, 100,000 times here in terms of orders of magnitude. Well, multiple orders of magnitude, which translate to 10,000 or 100,000x. And, that is a huge thing. Like this, the food we eat can create signals for our whole body through the immune system. And that I would argue is one of the ways that a carnivorous diet can affect humans positively. The removal of the plant toxins can potentially change the immunologic signaling, which begins in our guts and affects the whole body, brain to everything else. So yeah, I think that the immune system is really the central part of the whole equation for us. Like, how is the immune system functioning? And the immune system is really the ultimate mediator of health and disease, I believe. That underlies things like depression, anxiety, and all of the known autoimmune diseases: Sjogren's, scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, eczema, psoriasis. There's so many autoimmune diseases.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point, right? So talking about the gut, the effects of diet on the gut, the effects of the gut on the brain and on our emotional state. A lot of people are concerned when they hear about a carnivorous diet. A lot of people are really concerned, like, how am I going to go to the bathroom, right? I thought fiber is what helps me poop. If I'm eating no fiber, aren't I going to get, colon cancer? Maybe I'm going to get constipation. Let's kind of go in, let's zoom in on the gut and get a little bit deeper into this. Are we missing something if we're not eating fiber?
No, we're not. And this is a super interesting thing. If people have not seen the debate with Layne Norton on Mark Bell's Power Project, I would direct them to that. That whole debate with Layne Norton got started because of a post that I did about fiber that Mark Bell reposted. So I've been on Mark Bell's podcast a few times, and there are so many studies now. I'm happy to cite a few, but there are so many studies now that suggest that fiber does not have benefits for the human organism. And there are studies which suggest that constipation actually improves and resolves when fiber is removed, which is completely counterintuitive.
I show people that one a lot. And you quick PubMed search for fiber constipation, remove fiber constipation, you'll see the study.
I can give people the reference if they want to know it right now. Yeah. It's from the World Journal of Gastroenterology. Give me a sec, I'll pull it up. I have it in my notes from the debate with Layne, but so it is a really mind-blowing thing. So the title of the study, I believe, is Stopping or Reducing Dietary Fiber Intake Reduces Constipation and Its Associated Symptoms. World Journal of Gastroenterology, September 2012. And so it's just incredible. In this study, they removed fiber in one of the groups, and the constipation, gas, and bloating symptoms completely resolved. So the conclusion was, for no fiber, reduced fiber, and high fiber groups, respectively, symptoms of bloating were present in 0%. So 0% in the no fiber group, 31.3 in the reduced fiber, and 100% in the high fiber group. Straining to pass stools occurred in 0% of the no fiber group, 43.8 in the reduced fiber, and 100% of the high fiber groups. And so, at the risk of, there are so many studies I could cite for people about this, that removal of fiber improves constipation, gas, and bloating. And then fiber itself has not been shown to benefit constipation in the studies that have been done. So both of the sides of the equation do not add up, which is like, so then people are asking themselves, why the hell have I been told fiber is so good? And I'll tell you why. It's because of medical fairy tales. Mm-hmm. And the medical fairy tale of fiber begins with a guy named Burkitt, who went to Tanzania, I believe maybe it was the 1960s or 1970s. And there are so many things like this where we as humans think that we know what's going on, and we are so wrong because we put these medical fairy tales together. So I'll tell the medical fairy tale about fiber is that Burkitt, for whom Burkitt's lymphoma is named, that's a completely different disease, went to Africa, went to Tanzania, in I believe it was 1960s, but don't quote me on that. I need to look at the actual history. And he saw that the incidence of diverticulosis was very low in Tanzania compared to the westernized world. Diverticulosis is a condition whereby the submucosal layers of the colon move through the mucosal layers to make these diverticulae, these sort of pouches.
Yeah.
And these can get infected, leading to diverticulitis. This was one thing I talked to Lane, I debated Lane a lot about in the podcast. But
and this is a really good section of the podcast. You guys got to check it out. Mark Bell with Paul Saladino and Lane Norton. Great conversation.
So like, yeah, the diverticuli are these outpouching. I'm making this diverticuli gesticulation with my hand. You know, it looks like a small appendix or a small pouch.
I'd hope it's not that big.
No, it's not this big.
That would hurt. But, I mean, that would hurt.
It looks like I'm Italian. I'm a Saladino, man. I talk.
Maybe if you're a raw vegan, you can get it that big.
You have a diverticulum that's that big. But the problem is that is not a healthy process. We know that the submucosal layer of the colon should not move through the muscularis mucosa and form these pockets. And the pockets are problematic before they become infected, because they can bleed and cause lower GI bleeding, which is a real issue. And they can also become closed, and that can cause diverticulitis, which is a major problem. It can cause it can cause bowel impaction, or it can cause sepsis if they rupture. It's basically like your appendix, right? Your appendix is this vestigial blind tube that can get impacted. And then if it ruptures, all the bacteria that are in there go into the sterile location of the peritoneum, which is a space between the abdominal wall and the actual bowel. And that is a horrible process. Anyway, so a diverticulum can get infected, it can rupture. So what Burkitt saw was that the incidence of diverticulosis, which is the outpouching, was not as high, was very low in these Tanzanians. And he also had observed they were eating a lot of fiber and having colossal shits. And so he said the medical fairy tale was the fiber is preventing diverticulosis. And unfortunately,
why not the equatorial sun? Why not? Why
not the absence
what about the other environmental factors?
Westernized food, right? Like, why not the absence of a highly refined westernized diet, which causes dysbiosis and inflammation? What we are actually now learning is that diverticulosis is not a disease of pressure, because people can get diverticuli in the right colon. So if you look at the colon, there's the right side, which is where the appendix is, the cecum. It goes across the transverse, then it goes down on the left side, and you get the sigmoid colon and the rectum. Well, the pressures are high on the left side of the colon, but the right side of the colon is actually pretty big and dilated, and there's not a lot of pressure there, and people can get right-sided diverticula as well. So the idea that diverticulosis is a pressure-related process doesn't seem to hold up in medicine. It's probably related to inflammation, and I would argue, again, it's probably autoimmune, because what you see is that there is lymphocytic infiltration at the site of the diverticula. We're getting a little granular here, but lymphocytes are immune cells in the body. So there is immunologic infiltration at the site of a diverticulum in the gut. So I would argue that diverticulosis may in fact be an autoimmune process, which is wild.
Now, how would you delineate between if it's autoimmune or if it's bacterial overgrowth, right? Like, what if it's, you could have a pathogenic bacteria, fungal yeast infection going on in there. Right. And you said earlier you think SIBO is autoimmune. I thought that was really interesting, but I didn't want to dive into that then. But you want to get in a little bit deeper into this?
Yeah, we can. So I'll finish the Burkitt fairy tale and draw a few parallels, and then I'll tell you about those things. Yeah. So what's interesting is that this is what we do as westernized humans. We see indigenous people or people who have non-westernized diets doing something that is healthy, and we think we misattribute something that they are doing as protective. So let me illustrate. Let me say what I mean by that. So in this case, Burkitt thought they are eating a ton of fiber, therefore the fiber is protective against diverticulosis. As we see in other studies, the study that got the debate with Lane started was a study that actually showed that increasing quartiles of people with fiber had increasing levels of diverticulosis. So in the US, when they did colonoscopy on people to see diverticulosis, the people that ate more fiber had more diverticulosis. Now, it's an association study. It doesn't prove causation, but it's interesting because as the quartiles went up, there was more diverticulosis, which is crazy. So if you would expect if there was no association that you wouldn't see that quartile increase. And then the question becomes, okay, it's epidemiology. They did surveys. How much fiber have you been eating? But then you sort of have to explain this in your mind. Like, what could it possibly have been that people were eating more fiber? if this is not due to the fiber, what else were people who were eating more fiber doing that
It could
cause
never possibly be because fiber isn't good for us, right? It could never be that.
Or the potential hypothesis is that, the fiber is associated with plants, which may not be good for us. And maybe the plants are causing autoimmunity. That's my hypothesis, right?
Okay.
Or it could be that fiber is not good for us. And we know that in people with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, fiber is a real problem. And people do not do well with fiber at all. So the whole thing is totally wild. The diverticulosis has not been shown to be improved with fiber. It's actually shown to correlate with fiber. We don't have causal studies, but it correlates with increased fiber intake. When you add fiber, it doesn't get better. Fiber doesn't do any of these things. So Burkitt was probably completely wrong about fiber and diverticulosis, but that's why we've been told. That's the fiber fairy tale. That's why we've been told that fiber is beneficial for us.
It's almost offensive that it might be the opposite, as in like fiber causing, or maybe not being causative directly, but fiber being implicated in the pathogenesis of these things. That's kind of really frustrating that people are being told the opposite. People who have Crohn's, people who have really intense autoimmune IBS issues are being told to eat more and more fiber, and they fall apart. They don't know where to go after that.
Yeah, somebody actually commented on my Instagram yesterday. I did a post about fiber. Virta, VIRTA is a group with Volek and Finney who are like interested in ketosis. And on their blog, they had posted that fiber was not necessary for a healthy microbiome or for the gut enterocytes. And that gets into the issue of short chain fatty acids, which we can also talk about.
Yeah, let's transition into that next, but go ahead.
Yeah, so there's so many things to talk about, right? Once we get in the rabbit hole, it's like, oh my God, there's so much. Where do we go?
It's like whack-a-mole. Just
I know, I can't do it all fast enough.
We'll do it again. There's always more podcasts, more streams we could do in the future.
So, but basically I posted about that. I said, look, Virta is agreeing with what I talked about with Lane. And someone commented with ulcerative colitis on the feed and said, yes, my ulcerative colitis is now in remission on a carnivore diet, which is interesting. It's an anecdote. It's an N of 1. But there's more and more people with inflammatory bowel disease who are finding improvements on a carnivorous diet. And he said, I feel so much better without fiber in my diet on ulcerative colitis. So I mentioned that because you were saying that people with inflammatory bowel disease, that is ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, don't do well with fiber. I would agree with that. And then I want to parallel these human medical fairy tales. The other one is the French paradox and the Inuit. So each of those. So when we look at France, people have looked at France and said, oh, they have lower rates of heart disease despite eating lots of saturated fat. Therefore, it must be the red wine. Well, if we look back at that, we can say, actually, maybe it's the fact that saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease.
No, it's the cigarettes. It's all the cigarettes. That's what it is. The tobacco is good for you.
Yeah, right. We love to make these medical fairy tales. And then people say, oh, red wine is good for you. And we can talk about resveratrol and all that stuff as well. And then if we look at the Inuit, people said, oh, the Inuit are eating tons of fat, tons of whale blubber, which we are sure causes heart disease, right? We know, asterisk, wink, wink, I'm being facetious here. We know that fat causes heart disease. Therefore, there must be something protective in the Inuit diet against heart disease. So they said, oh, it's the omega-3s. When in fact, it's probably just the fact that a non-westernized, non-processed food diet is way the hell healthier than a westernized diet. And you don't really see heart disease, and fat doesn't cause heart disease. And what we've seen is that omega-3s don't actually show major protection in terms of primary prevention against heart disease. They're very beneficial for our brains, and they improve the function of our membranes. We need omega-3s, but omega-3s are probably not what we're protecting the Inuit from heart disease. It was probably the fact that they were not eating the shit that was causing heart disease. And the Inuit are a very interesting culture because they're often considered to be essentially carnivorous. So that's a whole nother issue. But
yeah, now have you read Stephenson's books? He's got some.
Yeah, I've glanced at it. I've read sort of pieces of it. I want to get more into it. Fat of the Land. There's a great quote in there.
There's
yeah.
Another one too. There's he's got a few, man. The Hunters of the Great North. This one's really cool. Hunters of the Great North.
I'll have to check it out.
And then I haven't read any of this one yet. It's pretty huge. My Life with the Eskimo. There seems like he got pretty in depth with that one.
It's so valuable to look at the indigenous cultures with regard to these sort of things. I mean, I'm seeing we could take a little sidebar here. I don't know if we want to go.
There's a million ways we could go. This could go. Let me finish one thought too. And I think you might find this interesting. All right. So atherogenesis, heart disease, atherosclerosis, there seems to be an implication or a very tight association between heart disease and insulin levels. Some people are saying, well, it's the insulin now. How do you feel about this? I mean, you mentioned you were in cardiology before. If we could we don't have to go super deep into it, but if you want to briefly touch on maybe your theory on what's causing a heart disease and what's actually the driving force behind that.
Yeah, man, this is complicated. I think it's a really interesting discussion. So one of the things that comes up all the time when you talk about a carnivorous diet is LDL. So LDL is low density lipoprotein. It's one of the lipoproteins in our blood. There is this conventional notion of cholesterol, and generally, colloquially, when we say cholesterol, we mean LDL. But there are other lipoproteins which carry the cholesterol moiety in the blood. Cholesterol is actually a sterol type molecule, which is transported along with triglycerides in lipoprotein particles, which are membrane-bound particles in the blood. And those other particles are HDL and precursor particles to LDL, which are VLDL and IDL, et cetera. So, and chylomicrons. Anyway, so there are many particles. Most of the discussion is around LDL and LDL particle number. And so what we tend to see, well, I'll back up. In studies, there is epidemiology to suggest that in the Western world only, not in Asia, we can talk about the Asian studies as well. In the Western world, in the Western US, in epidemiology, when we do surveys of people, and these are epidemiology, either prospective or retrospective cohorts, where they look at people and they say, we're going to take a survey of people and ask this set of people what they ate for the last 20 years. And they look at that group of people. And in the group of people who provide information about what they ate in the last 20 years, they find epidemiologically that those who ate more red meat had more incidence of heart disease. Now that is epidemiology. And this is something I said many times in the podcast with Lane. It is confounded by what is called healthy user bias, which is the idea that this is not a causation study. There's never been a study where they give people red meat. I would love to see that study where we have a group of people and we just feed them red meat for 10 years and we look to see if they develop heart disease. I will sign up for that study. I would love to be given all the free red meat I can eat for 10 years. But that's never been done. What they're doing is they're looking back at a survey. And the reason this is confounded by what's called healthy user bias is that for the last 40 years, we have been told in the West that red meat is bad for us. So people that eat red meat are people that are rebels. They're also more likely to do other things that are bad for them, but probably fun. I'm not advocating these things, but they're probably more likely to smoke, to drink. I shouldn't have said that. I don't think smoking and drinking are good for health at all. But anyway, they're less likely to seek medical care. They're less likely to have higher socioeconomic status. They're less likely to follow physician's orders. They're less likely to exercise. They're less likely to be in the sun. So people that have eaten red meat in these studies do all the other shitty things. And that is potentially the cause of their heart disease rather than the red meat.
Well, red meat could equal a hamburger from McDonald's, and then you've got 5 apple pies, a couple fries. It's like, how much red meat's really in that?
Exactly. They're essentially worthless. And so Lane brought this up repeatedly with regard to fiber in the debate. And he said, people that eat more fiber have better cardiovascular outcomes. And I said, that is pure bullshit, man. That is pure bullshit. Because that is, again, healthy user bias. The people that have eaten more fiber are people that were also doing other healthy behaviors, right? Yeah. And if you look at all the other studies, there's a real discordance that in the fiber literature. There's nothing to suggest that fiber is beneficial. So the people who are doing those things were eating more fiber. What those studies probably say is that we should exercise, we should be in the sun, we should be doing all the other healthy behaviors those people were doing, but not eating the fiber, in my opinion. So the heart disease thing with regard to red meat is mostly based on epidemiologic studies, right? And so this is where we get into the real nuts and bolts of it. We get into cholesterol and what causes atherosclerosis. Now, if we look at the literature, I got into a debate with a doctor in San Diego the other day on my Instagram named Spencer Nadolski, who's actually a really cool guy. He's a family practice doc down there. So I posted my lipids on 6 months of a carnivore diet, of a purely carnivorous diet. And what we see is what I see consistently in clinical practice on people on a carnivorous diet, or generally on ketogenic diets, is that the LDL particle number is high. My LDL number is high. Now, LDL number can be in milligrams per deciliter, or it can be particle number. And the particle number is something we need to do NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, to see the LDL particle number. But the particle number is high in people on ketogenic diets or carnivorous diets. And so if we look
not all of them, but some. Like me,
that's right,
myself, like I get very high LDL on keto and on carnivore.
I saw Michaela Peterson posted her labs when she talked to Rob
low
Wolf
LDL,
recently.
yeah.
She has a very low LDL particle number, which is interesting because her LDL particles are small. So it's strange, like then we can look at particle size. Like my LDL particles were very large. They were 22.4 nanometers. And I jokingly asked Spencer whose balls were bigger, like whose particles were bigger.
Exactly.
He didn't
measuring
get
your
back to me.
kilomicrons there. Come on.
The LDL size, not the kilomicron, but yeah. So he didn't get back to me, but again, Spencer's a great guy, and we're going to be working together to like advance the understanding of lipids. But the thing is that in the setting of an elevated LDL, there are probably two different phenotypes, phenotype is a word we use in medicine to mean like the external appearance of something. Yeah. There are probably 2 or 3 different disease states that go along with high LDL. The traditionally high LDL is achieved through insulin resistance, like you were saying, the insulin insensitivity of an individual. That is diabetes, synonymous with diabetes. So most people get high LDL with insulin resistant states. And that is, you see a low HDL and a high triglyceride when that happens. That phenotype, that constellation of high LDL, low HDL, high triglycerides is associated with what we call the metabolic syndrome or an insulin resistant state. We see a discordant phenotype in individuals like you and me on ketogenic diets. We know that we are very insulin sensitive. Fasting insulin is a very good measure of this, and it's very low in individuals on ketogenic diets. It's around 2. If people have not had their fasting insulin level checked, I would urge them to ask for that from their physician, because I think the fasting insulin is one of the tests that's never done that can really help differentiate risk.
Yeah, it can be kind of expensive. It's not that cheap.
Oh, really? I think in the U.S. it's not that expensive at all for
really?
fasting insulin.
Oh, I'd heard people complain about it. Here
really?
It's relatively cheap to get fasting insulin tested. It's like $25.
No, I think it's pretty cheap. I heard somebody else. I'd have to confirm it. I think it's maybe like $40.
Okay, cool.
Oh, who knows? But
I'm sorry, guys. Spreading misinformation here. Go get
that. I don't know. We'll see. So fasting insulin. But what we see is that we see high LDL numbers with high HDL and low triglycerides. And what people will see on my Instagram is that my small dense LDL is very small, very low. So I don't have a lot of small dense LDL, meaning my LDL particles are big. So I have a lot of big particles. I have a lot of big balls of LDL. Now, that I would argue is a different phenotype than someone with small dense LDL or lots of LDL in the setting of insulin resistance. So the question that we need to answer in medicine, and that is probably going to be researched in the future, is an LDL particle number that is elevated equally atherogenic in the setting of insulin sensitivity in the absence of insulin resistance, right?
Right. So in a low insulin state, in a low glucose state, when you got very low stable blood glucose, no insulin constantly spiking.
Yep. You're not diabetic. There's not inflammation. If people look at my labs on Instagram, all the times I've checked HSCRP, that's been 0.3 or less, which is basically the absolute lower end of normal. So any claims that meat is inflammatory have not been supported by any of my self experimentation. And I have checked my HSCRP 4 or 5 times, and every single time it is 0.3. And I've checked other inflammatory markers like fibrinogen, and what else did I check? Ferritin is an acute phase reactant that is sometimes used. So anyway, my inflammatory markers on an all-meat diet, or I should say an animal-based diet, because I definitely do not just eat all meat, are extremely low. I did a YouTube video about that people can watch. But so what we have is a phenotype where the LDL particle number is high, but there's no inflammation and there's no insulin resistance. And the question becomes, is that going to lead to heart disease? And this is really where we differ, where nobody knows. Nobody knows the answer to this.
A lot of people say they do.
Right.
That's the problem.
It becomes a hypothesis. And so as a physician, I can't say to my clients or patients like, hey, your LDL particle number is 2,500. You are not going to get atherosclerosis. I say to them, we don't know. But this appears to be a different phenotype, and it appears to be a different risk ratio. What has been shown pretty elegantly by people like Ivor Cummins on YouTube, if you just search Ivor Cummins and some of his cholesterol videos on YouTube.
The Fat Emperor.
The fat emperor, he has done analyses of Framingham data, and I posted this on my Instagram as well. Taken from one of his slides was the idea that if you stratify cardiovascular disease risk into, as you raise LDL, when in two groups of people. So we're going to go, so the x-axis is raising LDL and the y-axis is cardiovascular disease risk. And the two groups of people that he stratified it into were people with high HDL and people with low HDL. Mm-hmm. And what do you see? You see a real discordance in the curves. They look like this, right? The curve with low HDL goes up. Yep. So that people, as LDL increases with low HDL, so low HDL, LDL increases across the bottom, cardiovascular disease risk goes up. Second curve, like this, right? Flat curve. LDL goes up, cardiovascular disease risk does not change in any significant manner when the HDL is high. Yeah. So that, to me, raises the really, really big question about what's going on here. And I think that is sort of at the root of the arguments here. There are lots of really smart people in this space, Tom Dayspring, Peter Attia, who I respect but disagree with. Tom Dayspring is a lipidologist. Peter Attia is a super smart guy, has his own podcast. And, those guys would say, hey, LDL particle number is the best predictor. We have to tell people that LDL particle number is dangerous. And so they would caution people in these states. Yeah. My thinking about that is this, and this is where it gets into some really interesting evolutionary sort of anthropology talk, is how could something that is evolutionarily consistent be bad for us? And that maybe is my own fantasy, and maybe that's a logical fallacy or a philosophical
It's a hard one to argue
error.
From that position. I kind of see where you're getting at. It's just I could see how an opponent could dismantle it in a way. Yeah, there might be a better approach angle, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. But it's like, look, you can imagine you or I hunting day in and day out and having essentially the same diet that we do now. What we are doing with a carnivorous diet is not something that is evolutionarily inconsistent. I would argue that a westernized standard American diet or a diet where people are eating a lot of plants is much more evolutionarily inconsistent, or I should say is much less evolutionarily consistent than a carnivorous diet or a mostly animal-based diet. And we can get into some of the anthropology.
I think Weston A. Price's book is what is something that demonstrates that really well. I mean, just looking back a few generations. This book came out when the baby boomers were before the baby boomers were even born. Like, this is 1930s. Weston Price was traveling around the world and visiting all these different cultures who were eating primarily animal foods with some plant foods. All the plant foods carefully selected, prepared in very specific ways to remove the anti-nutrients. And none of these people would have self-selected plant foods exclusively to eat them, and couldn't have done that in their environment. And their health declined as soon as they started giving up their meats, their fish, their shellfish. As soon as they started giving this up for the marmalades, for the jams, for the imported canned foods, their health fell apart, their teeth started falling out, they got tuberculosis, and the moral fabric of their society declined as well. With the global McMonoculture foods that were given, the McDisney foods come into the culture and it destroys it. So I think this is something that's observed over and over again. And actually, when you read, there's books. I think Nutrition and Physical Degeneration would probably be the first one that I would recommend anybody who's interested in anthropology and nutrition to look at.
Yeah. And, this is an interesting concept and perhaps a bit of a short segue into anthropology. Vilhjalmur Stephenson has a quote from Fat of the Land that the Inuit preferred animal foods exclusively, and they would shun plant foods unless animal foods were not available. The idea that, I think it's from that book, they said, we don't eat plants unless real food is not available. And I'm doing air quotes, real food. And the real food is animals. So there is historical anthropologic precedent for exclusion of plant foods in preference of animal foods in many, many cultures.
Well, I think look at our culture. There's people like you who are experimenting with diet, who are eating plant foods, or even eating exclusively plant foods for a little bit. You saw that didn't work. You see how your body changes. You see how it functions. You're self-selecting to eat only animal foods. To think that none of our ancestors would have been doing this and to argue from that point is absolutely ridiculous. on the other hand, it's ridiculous to say, oh, well, our ancestors were probably eating mostly berries. You know, they would go a few days and maybe get into ketosis every once in a while, and then they'd find a berry bush, and they would save their life by consuming the berries. And I heard a vegan doctor literally argue that the benefits of ketosis come after you find a berry bush, because all those plants just flood your body with planty goodness. This is what the guy says. God. This is a doctor, Dr. Clapper. He said this. So I completely agree with you there, and I think it's interesting that you and I, with all the foods that we could have available to us, or every food available to us at any time of the day, we're still choosing just to eat animal foods. We're eating meat, we're eating eggs, fish, shellfish, or at least that's what I eat. The organ meats and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's pretty similar to what I eat. What I would say at this moment is sort of the overarching thesis that I have for a carnivorous diet. And that, simply stated, is that animal foods provide all of the nutrients that a human needs for optimal health in the most highly bioavailable forms without any of the anti-nutrients or toxins found in plants. So that is the simple thesis. And that is, I think that there are pieces of that people would debate. But the first segment of that statement, animal foods provide all of the nutrients that a human needs in the most bioavailable forms to live optimally. That is pretty hard to debate nutritionally and factually. Like, if we look at that statement, the first part of that statement, animal foods provide all of the nutrients a human needs to live optimally. Like, that is difficult to debate, like, nutritionally. That is almost fact.
Well,
right?
All right, let me play vegan's advocate here.
Yes.
The vegans say the same thing, right? On paper, plant foods have every single nutrient that you need, and we can digest them because if we combine lentils with mung beans, and it's like that, you have, on paper, a vegan diet does the same thing. Amino acids come from plants, they'll say, right? So what's the problem with that argument? How would you refute that?
So here's the deal.
I thought you were peeling a banana there, but it's just paper. Okay.
No.
Don't worry, guys.
Peeling my notes, bro. So if you look at that argument, I would argue to that argument that is a flawed argument on the vegan side for a number of reasons. Vegan diets, that is vegetable plant-based diets, leave out many important nutrients that humans need. Now, this is, I think, a very granular, important point to highlight. This is not true with animal foods. If you eat a vegan diet, you will not get vitamin B12. You will essentially get no carnitine, no carnosine, no taurine, right? And you will probably quickly become deficient in many things like riboflavin and zinc and other minerals and vitamins. So there's also a dearth of K2. K2 does not exist, so there's vitamin K1, vitamin K2. K2 is menaquinone, MK4, MK7, MK11. That does not exist in plants. Vegans may say, oh, you can convert you can convert K1 to K2, but the rate at which we do that is likely insufficient. So I would argue that the vegans who are saying you can get everything you need from plant foods are wrong. And at this point, we are on solid ground. We can use nutritional textbooks to refute this. There is absolutely no available B12 in plant foods. There is no taurine. There is no L-carnitine. There is no carnosine.
What about zinc too? I mean, just the deficiencies in things like zinc, copper.
Zinc and copper, exactly. When I was a vegan, the only place I could get zinc, was pumpkin seeds. And I will guarantee you that you will not get enough zinc in pumpkin seeds because of the phytic acid. So intuitively, just logically, it does not make sense for me to advocate any diet in which there is only one food in the whole diet across the entire planet that gives you a shred of ability to get an adequate amount of a nutrient, which is probably bound to phytic acid. Selenium is another good thing. If you look at selenium in plant foods, people say, oh, Brazil nuts. And I'm like, well, I hope you live in Brazil, because
we got Brazil nuts in Ecuador, but you know how hard a Brazil nut is to open? There's one animal in the Amazon that can open the Brazil nut, and it's this rat with these freaking fangs that are sticking out his freaking face. That's the only thing that can open them, dude. Obviously, humans using tools, but it's like what I'm getting at is this is a difficult food to eat a significant amount of.
It only occurs in parts of the world, right? Like evolutionarily, if you depend on plant foods, you will become nutrient deficient within your local ecosystem evolutionarily. You cannot use plant foods to get everything you need just by the virtue of plant foods, and also based on, if you were the best hunter gatherer in the world. The opposite is not true at all of animal foods. Animal foods provide everything a human needs in the more bioavailable forms, which is an interesting piece of this equation. If you look at things like vitamin A, in plant foods is beta carotene, in animal foods is retinol. So it's preformed. Retinol is the form of vitamin A that we use in our bodies. There are single nucleotide polymorphisms in genes which inhibit our ability to convert beta carotene to retinol in many people. So beta carotene, heme iron, try and correct an iron deficiency with plant foods. It doesn't work.
How about all these people talking about heme iron being a problem and high iron being one of the major causes of disease? You see this in the functional medicine community. A lot of people are a little bit freaked out about the iron levels. I just want to say this before I hear your answer. I've seen a lot of people who've tested their iron levels who had issues with too high of iron. They started eating carnivorous and it corrected.
That's interesting to me. So the heme iron is interesting. So Lane and I talked about this on the podcast as well. There are a couple of things about iron. So there are people in the population who have genetic mutations in a gene called the HFE gene, which is the transporter for iron in the gut. And this is the gene for hemochromatosis. So there are people who can absorb too much iron if they are getting a high iron diet. Now, the treatment for this is phlebotomy, and that probably is something that is a genetic mutation that occurs independent of anything that you're eating. But if you have hemochromatosis and you're eating a ton of meat, you'd want to know your iron status and do phlebotomy to get rid of it. In the absence of hemochromatosis, I think that heme iron is a red herring, and I'll tell you why. Heme iron has only been shown to be a carcinogen in rodent models in which they were fed calcium-deficient diets, right? There's never been a study in humans which showed that heme iron had any teratogenicity in the setting of an adequately nutrient-full diet. So heme iron has been shown to be teratogenic or causing precancerous lesions in the colons of rats when they're fed a calcium-deficient diet. That's a rat, and you're depriving them of calcium. So if you eat the whole animal, and we're eating bone meal, and we're eating calcium sources, we're eating fish bones, if we're getting calcium and we're not a rat, there's no evidence that heme iron is a problem. Heme iron is also probably a problem if you combine it with N-nitroso compounds like the synthetic nitrates that are added to foods as preservatives. Something I did not go into the podcast in much detail with when I spoke with Lane was this idea of nitrates. I think that most people are familiar with nitrates added to foods. These have been associated with gastric and GI cancers, and these are probably a problem. And so I would limit your consumption of nitrate-consuming foods. And the heme iron and the nitrates can form or interact with N-nitroso compounds, which are probably bad. So heme iron may be a problem when you combine that oxidative moiety with N-nitroso compounds or nitrates. But in the absence of...
And where do we get these nitrates from? Where is the source of those nitrates in the natural world?
Plants.
Oh, whoa there, doctor. Let's shut it down, guys. Shut it down.
Plants are the source of nitrates, you guys. So
you're totally going against what we would have assumed from what we were told, right? We were told that the nitrates, if you eat bacon, you're getting all the nitrates. If you eat the bacon, you're killing yourself. But plants have these things too, huh?
The nitrates are not in the bacon. The nitrates are added to the bacon in the preservation process. So if you want to eat bacon, quote unquote, or you want to eat pork belly, you should just go to the butcher and get non-cured pork belly, which won't have any nitrates in it. Yeah. And that's delicious. And
it's not as good as beef, though, is it? Something that's
I don't know. I mean,
how much pork do you eat?
Pork belly's pretty good. Pork belly's pretty fucking good.
Yeah. How often do you eat pork? Because I find that I don't feel as good when I go
I don't eat pork because I can't source it well. I cannot source it well. Yeah. If I could source pork organically and I could get a wild animal that was a monogastric. I mean, so ruminants are like cows, and then pigs are monogastric. So pigs are more like humans. They're monogastric in their digestive system. So a monogastric animal like a pig, if I could get that wild or organic, I would eat that and see how I felt. But
you're going to go hang out with Ben Greenfield. Doesn't he go hunting for those? He goes hunt for those pigs over in Hawaii.
Yeah. I'm gonna I'll go hunting with Ben. I would eat one of those. I would definitely eat one of those.
Okay. I'll have
For
some
sure.
too. You go hunting with Ben Greenfield. You give me some
I'm
of
bringing
that
back.
wild
I'm,
macadamia-fed pork belly, and
yeah, I'll eat that. I'll
yeah,
eat that. So, it's an interesting thing because the the ruminants versus the monogastrics and the sources of all those things. But heme iron is the cure for anemia. So, like, heme iron is a great way to not become anemic and to have lots of red blood cells. I will add at this point in the conversation, in support for what you were saying, that in the carnivores that I have looked at their labs, my own labs, other people that I work with, the iron stores do not go through the roof. They're actually pretty darn normal. In someone without hemochromatosis, your body has the ability to regulate the iron very well. Now, I'm not saying that someone with hemochromatosis could not eat carnivore. I'm just saying if you have hemochromatosis, you need to know, and regardless of what you're eating, you need to get phlebotomy so you don't get iron overload.
I mean, how prominent is anemia compared to the other side of the spectrum? It seems more people are anemic these days than they are, overloaded with iron.
Yes,
it seems to me.
Iron deficiency is pretty common because of things like GI issues, malabsorption, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Veganism.
Yes, yep. Because of non-heme iron in those plants. So yeah, that's the whole rabbit hole. So I think, let me make sure that we went through the whole discussion about LDL.
Yeah.
So basically, I think we covered that whole thing. The idea is that there need to be more studies about low carbohydrate situations with a high LDL. Oh, that was
like the
segue.
hyper responder. I think a good search term, hyper responder, lean mass hyper responder, Dave Feldman, and he's come on the show. We've talked about that. So if you guys want to reference those episodes or other videos from Dave Feldman on his YouTube channel, have you gotten into LDL on your channel yet, Dr. Saladino?
I haven't gotten into it on my channel yet because it is such a rabbit hole.
I know, right? It's like, where do you start and when do you stop?
It's probably going to take me an hour to get into it. I've gotten into it on my Instagram. People like Dave are doing a great job. People like Ivor are doing a great job. Oh, I remember now. So the LDL discussion went into the anthropology discussion.
Yes.
There was something else I want to talk about with anthropology. So we talked about the Inuit. We talked about real food, the shunning of plants. And we talked about the fact that the animal foods can provide all of the nutrients that we need without any plant toxins. The only thing I'll add to that discussion is people will say vitamin C. And there's a lot of discussion now about vitamin C in the carnivore world. It appears that there are a couple of things to know about vitamin C. I think there were experiments done in World War I or World War II where they took people and they made them scorbutic. They gave them scurvy, and then they looked to see how much vitamin C was needed to prevent the scurvy, and it was only 10 milligrams a day. And if you look at meat, there's probably about 10 milligrams of vitamin C in meat that is not denatured when you cook it. So eating a pound of meat a day will give you enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. And then if you eat other parts of the animal, like the liver, you'll get even more vitamin C.
Right, so if you eat it very rare, you're going to be destroing the less of it too, right? So if you're eating it, if you cook your steak rare like I do, some people even like eating it raw, carpaccio, stuff like that. You're not going to be destroying the vitamin C.
Yeah. There's never been a case of scurvy in the carnivore community that I've ever seen. The
Sean Baker kind of looks like he's almost a scurvy level. We got to watch Dr. Baker. He's almost broken a world record, I think, on the rowing machine.
He did. I think he did. He definitely won the world championships for the masters division, and I think he was third place overall or something.
Maybe the scurvy gives him an advantage, like he feels less pain or something. Right?
And then there's Joe Anderson and his wife Charlene, who are on Instagram, and those guys look pretty darn healthy.
And to be fair, and to the vegans, I'm sure there's some vegans in the chat who are triggered right now. To be fair, just because someone looks healthy doesn't mean they're healthy. But hey, 20 years this woman has chronic Lyme's disease, and she's been managing it using a carnivorous diet. So if you want to hate on that, a woman stopping her suffering with Lyme's disease with carnivore, then go ahead and try. But she does look fantastic, especially considering she has a serious autoimmune disease that would ravage most people.
Yeah. And the other thing is, medically, I can look at this in people, I can see their vitamin C level. I can see problems with inflammation, and you don't see this in people on a carnivorous diet. You can check the vitamin C level, on people. So I can actually do labs beyond, and I've done it on myself. You can do labs beyond the way someone looks and prove like, hey, there's no scurvy here. There's no scurvy here. Yeah. So the only reason I mention that is because vegans may say, there is not enough vitamin C in animal foods, and that is incorrect. Especially if you eat the brain, there's a lot of vitamin C in the brain. Yep. So that's just a crazy concept that like everything that a human needs is in an animal. And then going back to the anthropology, I just wanted to highlight something else that I came across in preparation for my little gallivant with Ben Greenfield. So Ben texted me and said, hey, or I heard him on a podcast say, hey, what about the Maasai? They have multiple herbs in their diet. And so I did a little research, and if people are interested in the Maasai, I found a paper from the Journal of Ethnobotany and Ethnomedicine. And this is such cool anthropology. It's published in 2006. The title of the study is Plant Use of the Maasai of the Sekenani Valley in Masai Mara, Kenya. And it's just so interesting because I love reading studies like this. They are so much different than what I am used to as a physician. This is like an anthropology study, but I think it's so cool. And what they found was that in the Maasai people who are now in this region of Kenya, there's another paper looking at the Loita Maasai, which predated this one, but both of the papers found about the same thing. And they looked at the use of plants by the Maasai. The Maasai have sometimes been considered to be a quote unquote carnivorous culture. And what they found was that the Maasai had 155 species of plants that they used. And of those species of plants, only 14 were used for food. The majority of the plants that the Maasai use are for medicinal, they're for wild animals, they're ceremonial, they're construction, they use it to make weapons, they use it for firewood,
clothing, there's so many
veterinary,
things you use plants for other than eating.
And if you go in, what's so cool is they actually have a section where they talk about what plants that were used for food and what they use them for. So I'll read you guys the food section for the Maasai. So if people don't know about the Maasai, they're in Kenya and they're a warrior tribe and they keep cattle. They're pastoralists now, so they're not hunting, but they eat meat, they drink milk, and they drink the blood of the animal. That's the majority of their diet.
You know that they had to be basically quarantined. Well, they didn't have to be, but the British essentially quarantined them. They were dominating other tribes so intensely, and they would conquer them, take their women, take their animals. So they had to be calmed down. They were so dominant in their region.
Yes, and that kind of goes back to like one of the things Weston Price said. I believe he's in Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, he made the juxtaposition that the tribes in Africa that ate more meat were more dominant than the tribes that ate less meat. Do you remember reading that?
Yes, absolutely. He says that a couple times in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So of the 14 plants, so I'm reading you the food section of this paper. 14 plants identified in the Sekenani were characterized as food. Most importantly, they list the genuses, right? The term food was generally referred to ripe fruits and berries eaten by women and children. So that's what they say. They do not use, in this study of the Sekenani Maasai, they do not use roots, stems, leaves, tubers, and
it's berries, and
it's
very short bursts. You don't have berries year round. It's like the berry bush is ripe, you pick it before some other animal gets them. The birds will get them.
And it's only used by the women and children. Perhaps, I think actually in Maasai culture, perhaps, I could be wrong about this, it's actually considered to be a point of strength that the men do not eat plant foods it's like a point of pride.
I wouldn't doubt it, man. It's like you do feel, I mean, I don't know. I mean, not like a manliness thing, but your body, my body at least, when I eat some plant foods, it just doesn't function as well. It doesn't break down and get destroyed if I have one plant, but there's certain plants that if I did eat, I would be, I wouldn't be feeling too good for a few days. I definitely don't think it's unlikely that they would say that.
So I thought that was so cool that they probably use, when the women or children are out and there are berries around, they'll eat them, So this gets into a concept that maybe I should have set the stage with in the beginning, and I've talked about this a little bit on my YouTube. This is sort of my idea about human carnivory, is that there are multiple types of carnivores. There are obligate and facultative carnivores. And my perspective is that humans are probably facultative carnivores. An obligate carnivore is an animal like a lion or a tiger that essentially eats meat exclusively and does not eat plants under any circumstances, and will get sick if they eat any plants. Now, we are not direct descendants of lions. If we go back far enough, we have common ancestors. We appear to be direct descendants of primates, which are, one could argue, omnivorous, which is an interesting term that we'll talk about. But, what appears to have happened is that we as humans became scavengers. And in the scavenging that we did, I believe that we became facultative carnivores. What do I mean by that? I mean by facultative carnivore means that an animal uses meat as its primary optimal food source, but has this really cool genetic evolutionary adaptation where they can use some plant foods for survival during times of starvation. And I believe that that may have allowed humans to thrive. The fact that we do have molars, we do have some teeth that could be said, maybe these are for plants at times. But then the corollary to that is those are probably just survival foods. We are evolved to eat plants for survival when shit hits the fan. But the argument that I am making in carnivory is that those are not the optimal foods for humans. And if we really want to be truly optimal, we would eat mostly or all animal foods, avoiding the toxins that are in plants. We are so advanced evolutionarily, or we are so cool as humans, as Homo sapiens and Homo erectus and Homo habilis, that we can eat plants if we need to, but those are not the optimal foods. So we can use them during times of starvation. If there's berries around, we'll probably eat them occasionally, but the animal foods are the optimal foods. And then if you go down that whole other rabbit hole, which we can go down, the plant foods are just full of toxins. What do you think about that concept?
As far as being a facultative carnivore,
yeah,
no, I absolutely agree. I think you and I, our behavior, I think all we need to do, we don't even have to look at the past. We could just look at right now. We can eat any foods we want. What foods do we do well with? What foods do we feel better with? What foods do we perform better with? What foods do we not, what foods don't make us spend half a day shitting on the toilet, farting and, grumpy and inflamed? It's the animal foods. So I think absolutely.
It is the animal foods.
My kids, we don't restrict any foods with them. They go to town, have a piece of cake every once in a while. I don't care. But if I have a piece of cake or a big steak in front of my daughter and my son too, they're going to pick the steak. That's
amazing, considering how addictive sugar is.
Yeah, well, we kind of started them young. Like Ryder's first food was liver.
That's amazing.
Yeah, other than breast milk.
Yeah. I have a niece. I have a 1-year-old niece, and I'm trying to encourage my sister to feed her a little bit of liver and see how she does. So
it's so easy to digest. Ryder asked for high liver yesterday. He was like, "I want rotten liver." He likes high liver. He loves it.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's so cool.
And you know what's interesting too? Our daughter, she was conceived like after our vegan experimental phase, right? And we were still eating a lot of quinoa, whole, we were eating lentils, and we were eating meat, but not a lot of it. We were eating some butter, but not a lot of it. And she had dental caries, like very, very bad dental caries. Like her teeth turned to powder. We started giving her butter. We started giving her grass-fed liver, grass-fed meat, making bone broth, kind of Weston A. Price style diet back in 2013. And the teeth hardened up, and now her adult teeth come out, and they're perfectly fine. Our second child, who's our son, is our second kid. Usually the consequent, after the first child, the kids usually have more autoimmune issues, more dental issues. The mother's depleted. Her mitochondria are dumping out several times, right? So usually they have more problems. Ryder's teeth are totally fine. He had no issues with his baby teeth. So,
and Weston Price talks about that. The idea, that's what's so cool about nutrition and physical degeneration, is that Weston Price was a dentist. And sort of the thesis of that book is that the fat-soluble nutrients, which are really only found in animal foods, are what create good dental health. When I was a vegan, I went to the dentist and they said, "You have 7 cavities." And I said, "That is impossible. I am eating the healthiest diet on the planet." So says David Avocado Wolf. And I was like, what is going on here? And I never got them filled. And since I started eating meat again, they've all gone away, because if the carie has not gone through the enamel, the teeth can reform. And so I haven't had any problems with my teeth recently. A couple of my clients are dentists, actually, and I love to talk to them about the carnivorous diet. There was some interesting stuff about this that I haven't talked about on any other podcast. There have been studies that have come out recently linking P. gingivalis, so bacteria in the mouth, P. gingivalis, to Alzheimer's. They actually find antibodies and perhaps even finding P. gingivalis in the brain of people with Alzheimer's, these neurofibrillary tangles in the brain that we know are problematic in these alpha-synucleinopathies, which is Alzheimer's. So what has been shown is that low carbohydrate diets improve the health of the dental microbiome and have been shown to decrease P. gingivalis. And I would be curious about your experiences, but since I went carnivore, strictly carnivore 6 months ago, I can go a whole day or more without brushing my teeth, and I never get that film on my teeth like I did before. My teeth are always smooth. Like, my dental health has improved. I still brush my teeth every day, but my dental health has improved, and you can see my gums are better. I had regression of my gums when I was paleo, when I was on a mixed diet. And so I think that the teeth benefit, just the dental benefits alone of a carnivorous diet, are striking.
Do you floss though? All the steaks, sometimes I find myself flossing where I didn't floss so much before because I get the bits.
You know what I do? I have a water pick. I like the water pick more. I feel like the floss can be traumatic to the gingival mucosa. Yeah, because it kind of gets down there and kind of cuts.
And a lot of the natural flosses, I don't like it actually. They put neem and stuff on it, which neem is an antibacterial. So it's like, this one has neem and it's mint. It's like every once in a while I'll use it. I'll just kind of get my finger. I did it earlier. I'll go like that. I'll pick it out. Whatever.
You should check out like a water pick. I love that we're talking about dental hygiene. You ever seen those like water picks? Those water flossers?
Oh, they're great. They feel like a little massage.
Oh yeah, I love those. That's what I use almost exclusively now. I may bring floss when I travel, but again, that's the other thing is I saw a post on Instagram about this. If you look at dental floss, like mainstream dental floss has all of these synthetic, I think they're like these like lubricants in it and stuff. Like people, you go to the grocery store and you get the waxed floss or the non-waxed floss. Like definitely Glide floss and like the super synthetic flosses have some pretty crazy chemicals in them. But even the regular flosses, like the Reach, that isn't like the Gore-Tex floss, like that has other chemicals. Now, it's probably a pretty small exposure. You're not swallowing the floss.
Well, this one too, like this is like supposedly good. It's got neem on it, but it's like, dude, I'm not trying to eat neem. That's a pesticide. Literally,
neem is a pesticide. Like neem is sometimes used as a birth control agent because it totally interrupts women's hormones. Like,
hey, you know that also what's used as a birth control agent is stevia. Stevia in very, very high doses sterilizes women temporarily.
That is so interesting. I'm writing that down. I didn't even know that, but.
It's huge doses, and it might be in rats too. But
yeah. Well, I think that let's talk about that. Maybe we should go down that rabbit hole a little bit, because I suggested a thesis, and I think that maybe we'll come back to that. Animal foods provide all the nutrients that a human needs to live optimally in the most bioavailable forms. We've pretty much talked about that. We can go into that. But the last part of that thesis is, I think, the most controversial and one of the most interesting parts, which is without the anti-nutrients and toxins found in plants. And I think this is something that many people are not aware of. And it's one of the most striking pieces of this equation. So
you got your list, man. You got a list of the offenders.
Oh my God.
Let's start from let's do the worst one last, right? I think hitting the hardest one last, the one that you think is the most poignant. Let's do that one last, but let's go through the list, man. There's a few of these toxins.
I know there are a few of the toxins. I don't even know where to start, man. So
can I throw one out? Can I just how about lectins?
Okay, we can talk about lectins. Let me set the frame for people a little bit here. So let's just make the frame. As we move into this territory, I wish we could put on the screen the meme from the Matrix where Morpheus says, "Forget everything you think you know," or whatever. I don't know exactly what he says. Maybe I'll look it up right now. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Like, I want everyone listening to this, whether it's live or not, to imagine Morpheus just telling you, forget everything you think you know as we move into the next part of the discussion. Like, let your mind be open to this, and because this is wild shit. Okay, now, from that perspective, imagine this. You are a plant. Maybe you're conscious and there are humans running around and you think that they're stupid and you're an enlightened plant, or maybe you're not conscious, but the plant you're a tree, right? Or you're a brassicate vegetable. You are stuck in the ground. You cannot move, right? But your purpose in life, what your genetic DNA, what your DNA is programmed to do is to reproduce and to churn and to put another plant on the earth. That is what we do with life. That is what life does. Life, the purpose or what life does is continue life. Whether you are a brassicate, whether you are a kale plant, whether you are a strawberry plant, whether you are a tomato plant, whether you are an oak tree, whether you are a human being or an elephant, life begets life, right? So as the plant, you are rooted in space. There's this funny, I think I heard this comedian say this once. He was like, would you rather drink the sweat from Mr. T as he like rolls out of so Mr. T like walks out of a gym and he's all sweaty. He like squeezes his shirt into like a glass. He's
For
like,
sure.
would you
Yeah,
rather
I'll take
drink that or be buried up to your neck and have your face painted like a soccer ball with a whole bunch of like South American guys hanging around?
I don't know. That sounds kind of kinky too. What if you can you be buried up to your neck and drink Mr. T's sweat?
But the reason I mention that is, imagine as a plant, you are essentially the second thing. You are essentially buried up to your neck with your head painted like a soccer ball with a bunch of guys from Central and South America hanging around you. And what I mean by that is you are rooted in the ground and there are a bunch of animals that would love to eat you. Like you look like dinner, breakfast, lunch, and dessert to that giraffe or that deer or that zebra. Like, and you're like, oh shit, I can't move. So what do you do evolutionarily? And again, this is anthropomorphism, but what do? You evolve toxins, you evolve defenses because you are rooted in space. You evolve plant toxins. And this is reality. This is real. So plants are smart. They have figured this out. Plants, probably the original plants that evolved on this planet didn't survive more than like one generation because whatever sort of animal or insect just walked over and was like, oh, great, this is brunch, and just ate them, and they were gone. So the first plant that evolved a toxin, and the insect came over and was like, oh man, that's bitter, and it gave me a stomach ache. I'm not going to eat this. That plant was like, haha, I got it figured out, motherfuckers, So that's the thing. And then they're going to put all sorts of defense mechanisms everywhere in that plant, except the fruits. Okay. So we can talk about all that, but in the roots, the stems, the leaves, and the seeds of a plant, you are going to put toxins if you want to survive as a plant. So that is the story that I'm asking people to imagine and think, yeah, that's right. And if you look at plants, that is exactly what has happened.
Yeah, and there's so many of them too. Like you mentioned, in the roots, in the seeds, in the leaves. I mean, just there, it's like, the seeds are full of saponins, lectins, phytates. The leaves are full of oxalates. A lot of the roots are full of oxalates. I mean, these are powerful compounds. There's so many of them in plants. I think that it's really important to understand too that when you look at any cultures who've consumed plants over the years, we do it carefully, and we always do it in a very specific way. Like in Italy, like the Saladinos over in Italy, when you guys first got tomatoes in Italy, the Italians wouldn't eat them. They actually would peel the peel off and take all the seeds out, and that's the only way that they would consume the tomatoes. So,
and that gets back to lectins, right? That's where most of the lectins are. Yeah. We can definitely talk about lectins. Lectins are carbohydrate binding proteins in plants that, seem to trigger immunologic reactions in humans. And the list is long of all the plant anti-nutrients and toxins. We can go through some of them, but it's really overwhelming. We can enumerate them for people so that they know. But the idea, you're totally right. The idea is that plants have defense chemicals in them because they are the soccer ball. They are you buried up to your neck, painted like a soccer ball with a bunch of South American guys hanging around you. They are defenseless until they evolve the toxins. And so plants don't want to get eaten. So all of evolution has been this evolutionary ladder of plants and animals evolving, and plants and animals evolving, and plants and animals evolving. And what's happened is that herbivorous animals have evolved ways to deal with plants, or have understood the behaviors they need to deal with plants. There was actually a really cool podcast that Ben Greenfield did with Frank Provenza this past week that I was listening to. Frank wrote a book called Nourish. And Frank is an animal scientist. And Frank was saying that if you allow cows to graze on plants in a pasture, they will eat a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And they are smart enough to eat only enough of the plant that they don't become toxic, right? They eat a small amount, then they move to something else. And so they know which plants, they know that every single plant has a chemical in it that's going to hurt them and going to make them nauseous. And so they understand that they can only eat a little bit of it. He was talking about sheep or pigs or goats would eat the young buds of a plant, but they would stop eating when they got to a toxic level or a nearly toxic level because they would become nauseous.
Yeah,
right?
you see
and
goats
this
and
idea,
sheep will do the same thing. You
yeah,
watch them,
they'll
eat a little bit of each one and move on.
Yeah, they'll sort of self-select. Now, I would argue that as humans, what probably happened to us is that we got smart enough to start hunting animals. So our ability, number one, to understand which plants are toxic to us is long gone. And number two, I don't think that there's been any selective pressures or any significant selective pressure to allow for human evolution with plants to tolerate those toxins in the last million years of Homo evolution, meaning the homogeneous evolution, whether it's Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, whatever. Like, I would argue that there have not been selective pressures for us to need to eat plants in that way. So we probably cannot tolerate those toxins. And that is what we see because we've been eating animals. Once we figured out that we can be community-based organisms, that we can scavenge, that we can eat the bone marrow, that we can eat the brains, that we can hunt in packs, we realized animals are the best source of human food. And we do not need to do this evolutionary warfare with plants like herbivores. And we've also lost the knowledge that plants are toxic to us. We'll go and eat kale every day, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I would argue that we'd be better off without eating any of it because of the animal foods. But that is sort of the evolutionary anthropologic context for this whole discussion, is that plants have toxins, plants are rooted. In order for plants to continue their own evolution, which is valid, they need to develop toxins. And if people look into these toxins, they will be shocked. And my hypothesis is that animal foods are the best sources. And if you eliminate these plant toxins, you will feel better. And there's nothing in the plants that you need or is beneficial.
All right. So what about? I think it's an interesting thing to look at when you consider the use of grains by a lot of these cultures. I mean, you've got these people in the Hebrides Islands, the Scottish populations in the Hebrides Islands. They were eating some oats, right? And they would soak them and ferment them. You look at like some of the older varieties of wheat. They seem to not be as terrible for people, and they seem to not cause as much problems as the modern wheat varieties. So what about the argument that, well, perhaps the glyphosate is one of the main driving forces behind the gut permeability issues, and perhaps without all this exposure to glyphosate, which opens up the microvilli in the gut, opens up the gut-brain barrier, and allows that leaky gut situation, perhaps we wouldn't be having such issues with the plants. What do you think about that? You think the glyphosate might be playing a part in this and making it more difficult for us to deal with these plant toxins that perhaps we should be able to deal with, which is the argument from the vegans. The vegans will say, well, if you're going carnivore, it's because you have gut issues. You just have to fix your gut issues and you can go back to eating tofu. Shout out to
there's
Goji
a couple
Man.
of there's a couple of pieces of that statement. I definitely think glyphosate is a problem. And we know that glyphosate has been shown in cell culture. Zach Bush has done that work. Glyphosate has been shown in cell culture to increase the TEER, which is the transepithelial electrical gradient, which is sort of our correlate. It's our clinical evaluation of leaky gut. So glyphosate has been shown to do that. Glyphosate has been shown to do a lot of things in the human body. It probably kills certain bacteria in the microbiome by inhibiting the shikimate pathway. And so glyphosate, I think, is a real issue. I do not think glyphosate is the reason we cannot tolerate plant toxins. I think that glyphosate is a separate issue from our inability to tolerate plant toxins. I would argue that evolutionarily, we have never really been able to tolerate plant toxins that well, and that that glyphosate is not behind our inability to tolerate plant toxins. Having said that, I almost feel like that's a moot point because glyphosate is pervasive. And if a vegan is saying, if a vegan would say, for instance, just eat organic vegetables and you'll be fine, I would say, yeah, you show me a truly organic vegetable. You show me a vegetable that doesn't have some soil, air, water contamination with glyphosate. And then we know that glyphosate is water soluble, so it's in all of our water supplies. So we are all exposed to it. I think that, you and I try and mitigate our exposure as much as possible. But potentially one of the great injustices that's been done to our generation is that Monsanto created this pervasive water-soluble pesticide and now sells it in hundreds of billions of pounds a year to businesses, and it is basically impossible to avoid. Did you mute? You muted? Can't hear you.
Sorry. Second time. I have to do that once every stream. Today I got 2 in. Your audience is probably laughing their ass off because I do that all the time. Um, yeah, well, luckily Bayer Monsanto is such a great company, and Bayer Pharmaceuticals wing can give us something to fix the problem when the glyphosate gets too heavy. They've got chemotherapy drugs eventually for us, and all that
That
goodness.
was a little bit of a sketchy merger, wasn't it? So yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
don't think about that though. Let's worry about Kim Kardashian's booty. How did Kim Kardashian
yeah,
get her luscious ass?
that's true. That's totally true. It's all
So,
just be
all right. So, what about
distracted.
this? I had another. Sorry, my son's rolling a car behind. There was another vegans advocate argument that I was going to make, but I think it slipped my mind. Um,
No worries, we can come back to
what
it.
about Oxalobacter formigenes and some of these other um, gut bacteria that will break down oxalate, that will break down some of these plant toxins? The argument is that, well, you've got Oxalobacter formigenes, so you have this bacteria that should be breaking it down, and we just don't have the bacteria, maybe because of some sort of negative impact on the gut microbiome from glyphosate or antibiotics. Therefore, we should correct the gut, and then we can eat as many oxalates as we want. What about that
Well,
argument?
let's talk to people about oxalates. I imagine your audience is aware of oxalates and what they are and stuff. But so oxalic acid is a 2-carbon molecule that is only found in plants. It is not a molecule that participates in human biochemistry in any way, shape, or form. And I think that will be something that we will come back to in this discussion. So what we will find repeatedly with many of these plant compounds is that the plant compounds, whether they are purported antioxidants or things like oxalates, do not participate in any human biochemistry in any way, shape, or form. So oxalic acid is a xenobiotic molecule. It's an alien molecule to humans. We don't make oxalic acid in our bodies, as far as I'm aware. So it's a foreign molecule to humans. It's only found in plants. It crystallizes and can cause major issues. So our ingestion of oxalic acid comes from plants. And the idea that we would have a bacteria that would break it down is a little bit of circular logic. I think if you eat foods that have oxalic acid, you may develop a bacteria in your gut that can break it down, but you're still going to absorb some of it because the bacteria cannot break all of it down. And when you absorb oxalic acid, then it becomes a real problem in your body based on your body's ability to detoxify it. Many kidney stones are calcium oxalate, and a lot of joint issues have been connected with oxalic acid. There are theories about autoimmune issues. Basically, the concern is that this toxic 2-carbon molecule can crystallize in the human body and cause a lot of immunologic activation, joint issues.
Thyroid issues.
Yeah, yes. I saw that paper by Sally Fallon. I believe it was Sally Fallon, or maybe it was someone else, saying that in people, I noted this in the last podcast that I was in people who are over the age of 50, I believe 80% of people, or 60 to 80% of people, had oxalate crystals in their thyroid over the age of 50.
Yep.
That is not
And they were not present in the generation previous. Right? It's
right.
like they'd done biopsies before, and this wasn't. This is a new thing. It's not. This is not something that was always happening.
Which is interesting to wonder why it's happening more now. Maybe that is a glyphosate thing or whatever. But yeah, oxalic acid does not belong in thyroids, nor does it belong in your kidneys. And so what are the foods with oxalate? Why does this matter? Who gives a shit? Well, spinach is one of the biggest offenders. So the next time somebody tells you that spinach is good for you, you tell them to shove the spinach up their ass, because that is total crap.
Well, if they're vegan, they might actually do a spinach enema, though. So
They
don't say that.
they
If
might,
they're vegan, don't tell them that, because then they'll do it.
they might. I mean, I think that the spinach. I don't know. Probably the most healthy way to do spinach is to use it as toilet paper anyway. That's about the
You know
only
what
thing.
sucks? The spinach tastes great. As far as like the greens go, spinach with a little bit of salt and butter. I mean, I don't crave it anymore, but I used to love that stuff, man. That used to be one of the few greens that I would eat.
I know. I mean, I agree. Spinach isn't horrible until you think about all the oxalate that's accumulating, and some people actually have pretty strong reactions to it.
Absolutely. I
Um,
mean, some people have gotten, I know people who've gotten kidney stones. Phil Escott did a vegan diet for a long time. Spinach smoothies, did his green smoothies all the time. He got kidney stones. A lot of these vegans get them.
which are probably calcium oxalates. So if you're getting calcium oxalate kidney stones on a vegan diet, you better think about like, oh shit, you may not doing the right thing. I remember when I was a vegan, I made a smoothie out of spinach and green and red peppers, and it was one of these like vegan soups, like just gazpacho type stuff. And man, I ate it, and like almost instantly, it was like boom, my stomach was so bloated. It was so painful. I just wanted to die. You just want to like just put a release valve in your stomach or something.
Well, all right. So just look at that smoothie. You got oxalate. You've got the you don't have phytates and peppers, but you have what other compounds do we have? Just in that example alone, just to give some examples of some of these plant toxins that are that might be harming us.
So here's the thing. So spinach is a big issue, but then also in that I had Solanaceae vegetables, which are the nightshades, peppers. So green and red peppers. Now these are really bad. So these have the chemicals that are found in nightshades. I believe it's solanine is one of the chemicals, and I was just looking about this with potatoes. There's another chemical that's related to solanine in these Solanaceae vegetables. But these vegetables, now Solanaceae is nightshade vegetables. We're talking tomato, peppers, eggplant, and what am I missing? Potatoes are the main ones. And then I think also goji berries are a nightshade, and there might be some other things in the Solanaceae family. But all the members of the paprika, chilies, all the peppers, in cell culture, just like glyphosate, these compounds have been shown to increase gut permeability. So the TEER, the transepithelial electrical resistance of cells, of gastrointestinal epithelial cells in cell culture, has been shown to be altered by Solanaceae vegetables. So one of the things I see in like the carnivore community that kind of raises my eyebrows a little bit is people eating meat and saying, hey, I'm carnivore and I'm going to put this hot sauce on my steak, or I'm going to put this pepper sauce on my steak because I like spicy food. Well, all of those foods, the plants in that genus, Solanaceae, have been found to increase gastrointestinal epithelial permeability. So this is like, what are we doing here? This is crazy. Why are we doing this? So that smoothie had a shitload of oxalates and a bunch of solanine and all the other potential lectins in the nightshade vegetables that just triggered me immediately. And I was like, man, I can't do that. It was so bad. But that's the main thing. So oxalates are a big deal. What else has oxalates? Spinach, rhubarb, nuts, especially almonds and kale. I mean, the list of oxalate vegetables is long, and you could make yourself an oxalate bomb easily. You just want to have, hey, let's have a salad. I'm going to put some kale, I'm going to put some spinach, I'm going to do some almonds on it, and I'm going to do a couple other nuts on this.
Collard greens are another really popular one, right? Like we used to grow them in our garden and stuff, but when you look at that, very, very high in oxalate.
Oxalates, yep. And then I think chard as well. You know, chard is an interesting vegetable. When I was vegan, I used to hate chard because it would give me some like scratchy feeling in the back of my throat. I was like, what is going on with that?
Yeah.
And now I think, like chard gives you this weird feeling in the back of your throat. Like,
what's that going to do in your gut? It makes your throat numb. What is that going to do to your gut?
It's not like, this is not, and that's the thing, is there are all these toxic compounds and the plants are putting them there so that I think about this and I have this reaction and think, I don't want to eat that plant. It gave me this weird feeling in my throat. Maybe I get a little nauseous. You know, interestingly, going back to this podcast with Fred Provenza that I was talking about, Fred was saying that when they gave cows anti-nausea medications, the cows would eat more grain, meaning that, you know, these grain-fed cattle are probably getting a little bit nauseous, and they are, you know, grain makes cattle nauseous. Grain is not a healthy thing for cattle, and that cattle will not eat as much grain as the ranchers.
There's only a certain amount you can give them, and then they get sick. Like there's a certain amount of grain that you can feed them, and then they'll start to become sick, and you'll lose profit, you know, as a producer.
And so they can give them anti-nausea drugs, and they'll eat more grain because they're getting sick from the grain. Just like I talked about those other animals getting sick from the plants when they're eating too much. So
that's why we need medical marijuana for the cows, dude.
So this idea that like we get feedback from plants, and the plant, we may not even notice this as we're eating the plants, but there's this idea that you're eating spinach, you feel a little nauseous, and if you mask it with like butter and salt or other foods, you may never realize like, man, the oxalates in that spinach are making me sick as a human, But evolutionarily, you probably would have been like, I am not eating that plant. There's another plant. Are you familiar with oxalis or sorrel? Sorrel?
Sorrel. Oh man, I had some of that. Yeah, like a decade ago. Um, I had a big salad.
So
I had a salad of it. It was disgusting. It's horrible.
it's like a delicacy. I'm sure that if you and I went to New York City, that they would not let either of us into a nice restaurant because we both look like riffraff. But if we could
Hey,
somehow,
maybe you. My well trimmed, groomed.
we would
I think
we
I
would
have
both
half a
have
ribeye in my beard right now.
we would both have to put on fancier clothes. Anyway, if we could
Deodorant.
sneak into, yeah, right. If we could sneak into a fancy restaurant, I bet we could find sorrel on the menu in a salad that's $25. And there are documented cases of people dying from sorrel soup. You can eat enough oxalic acid to kill yourself
Yeah.
from sorrel. Like you can die from sorrel.
Somebody
The other thing-
did.
Yes.
That's what you're getting
Yes.
to. Are you getting, will you tell that story? Do you know the details of it?
I just know that I saw it in the paper about oxalates. Do you know the story?
Well, all right. So he was like a diabetic guy, I guess, and he was he had relatively low kidney function, so he already had some autoimmune conditions. Had a huge bowl of sorrel soup and died. Like by the time he got to the hospital, he was clinically dead of oxalate poisoning.
Oxalate toxicity.
They actually
Now,
used to use oxalate to poison people intentionally. Like assassins used to use oxalate to kill people because it was basically almost impossible to trace.
that's crazy. You know what else assassins use? Should we talk about cyanogenic glycosides?
Yes, sir.
So cyanide is what we're talking about. So assassins use cyanide, which is like that almond smell. And so if you look at the seeds of stone fruits, that is almonds before they were domesticated. So almonds are from a lineage of seeds that have cyanogenic glycosides, just like apricots and I believe cherries and nectarines, all the things with like the little almond type kernel in the stone fruit seed.
Yep.
All the stone fruit seeds, plums, that seed is full of cyanogenic glycosides. Now, this gets a little technical, but it's a really interesting story, and it's going to connect to broccoli sprouts. So cyanogenic glycosides break down into cyanide in the body of humans. And so these are totally fucking toxic. Like you can get a pretty darn poisonous dose of almond kernels. And I was actually in Los Angeles, and I was really surprised to see they were selling like these Hunza. You know these Hunza people?
People sell them. They sell those apricot kernels because they have supposedly vitamin B17 in them. And have you heard the claims that it's an alternate cancer therapy? So people think that
Yes.
they're getting anti-cancer properties from them.
Yeah, but these apricot kernels have cyanogenic glycosides, and if people eat enough, they could get a potentially poisonous or a pretty bad dose of the cyanide from the cyanogenic glycosides.
They
And so,
believe that they're curing cancer when they eat them. That they believe that it's attacking cancer cells in their body.
right, and
Now, what about that argument? So it's like people talk about antioxidants, phytonutrients, flavonoids. Well, they might be negatively affecting tissues directly, but then the reciprocal response from the body is to create other compounds that will deal with it. Could that be going on with the cyanide in the body? It's boosting the
not
immune
with
system.
cyanide. Not with cyanide, but potentially with polyphenols, and we can talk about the concept of hormesis. But cyanide is a molecule that is just toxic. There is no positive dose of cyanide. It is a mitochondrial, I believe it's complex 4, but I could be wrong. It inhibits, maybe it's in complex 1, I don't know. Cyanide irreversibly inhibits one of the complexes in the mitochondrial electron transport chain and will cause death by mitochondrial absolute standstill if taken in large enough amounts. So the fact that these seeds have cyanogenic glycosides is a clear signal from the plant: do not eat my baby, do not eat my offspring. And these cyanogenic glycosides are in a lot of foods. Now, this is also the problem with cassava. So this kind of segues a little bit into our discussion of tubers, but cassava is a root that is eaten throughout the world because people are in these situations where they can't get enough animal foods, presumably, or they're using it. But cassava, if you eat cassava raw, you will die. Like it is extremely toxic. And so in order to prepare cassava, this goes back to kind of like what you were saying, when plants are eaten by indigenous cultures, they are eaten very carefully and they are processed carefully to remove all the toxins.
Yeah.
We don't do that much now in our current society. And it speaks to the ancestral wisdom, for lack of a less cheesy term, around these foods. And it also speaks to the fact that it's a pain in the butt to eat plant foods when you're an indigenous person. Like, you might find them and say, hey, let's have this as a store in case things get really bad for us and we need to starve, but they're not easy to eat. It's not like you're walking out, fruits are a whole different story, but it's not like they're walking down the street and they're like, oh, there's an almond, I'll just eat an almond, like acorns or hickory nuts, for instance, with indigenous Native Americans. Those are really toxic unless you grind them up and you soak them and you detoxify them and you get the tannins out. You can't eat them unless you do all this effort.
Exactly. I mean, go outside in your yard, or, if I go behind in the mountains behind my house right here in the Andes, there's maybe 2 plants that I know of growing up in the mountains that you can eat without dying. But should you be eating them regularly? Like, one of them's a wild spinach variety, it's called. So who knows what the oxalate content on this one is, especially since it's wild. But you can't just go out and start picking random green plants. You don't even want to. Like, they don't look delicious. You can't. There's no desire. There's no drive for that. It's like, if I had to, maybe. But you can't eat the plants out here.
That's an experiment that I would recommend that no one ever do, but it would be instructive. I used to do that when I was a vegan. I would be running with my friends, and between my bathroom breaks, I would just pick some dandelion and eat that.
Yeah, you're like, oh, dude, look, it's edible. It's all good. Check it out, wild spinach.
I'm so smart. I'm just gonna eat some dandelion.
It's a superfood. Look at all the nutrients I'm getting from 3 leaves.
And it's yellow flower that clearly doesn't want me to eat it. Yeah, it's crazy. So I mean, but I went for a hike recently in Southern California when I was down there filming at Mentor Box, and I was at Will Rogers, and you just look around and you're like, every plant here is toxic. Like, there is no plant here that I don't recommend people do this, but I mean, you can imagine, like, if you were just a human on the earth, you'd probably go around like eating all the plants around you, and you'd be like, oh, that one made me feel like crap. That one made me feel like crap. Like there is not a lot of really benign food out there in the plant world. There might be a few plants, like we talked about, that might be tolerable.
But almost any mammal, you can eat them from head to toe.
Absolutely. You can eat them from head to toe without any toxins. There are 0 known toxins. I said this in debate with Lane. Like, if you kill a deer, there are 0 toxins in that animal.
No, but what about pufferfish? What about blowfish? You can't eat the pufferfish. Come on.
It's only a certain part of the pufferfish, right?
Right, people do eat the pufferfish.
Right. It's like
people eat scorpions, man. People eat snake. You know what they do here? There's a few guys here who make snake juice. They take the punta, which is like really hot, like really intense rum from sugarcane, and they'll take like a coral snake or an equus, like a viper, a dead snake, and they'll just throw it in the jar so that the snake juice kind of ferments in there with it.
Oh my god!
And then I've never tried it, man. I don't know about that. I get some dark side shit right there.
I know some neurotoxins. But...
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Oh my god! But yeah, so there's this interesting idea that the plants are pretty much toxic. The oxalates are toxic. We were talking about the cyanogenic glycosides and cassava. So what happens when you ingest cyanogenic glycosides is that your body can detoxify it into thiocyanate, right? Now, thiocyanate is interesting because thiocyanate is a lot like isothiocyanate, and thiocyanate is pretty much analogous to glucosinolates. And I'm using a lot of big words here, but now we're getting into the realm of broccoli. So we're crossing over. So what I'm talking about are compounds that look like each other from disparate plant families. We first started talking about cassava with cyanogenic glycosides, but when your body detoxifies cyanide, it makes thiocyanate. Isothiocyanates are compounds that are found in brassicate vegetables. So what I am saying is that the detoxification of cyanide makes compounds that are essentially the same as what are found in brassicate vegetables. And the problem is that those compounds that are found in brassicate vegetables are also toxic to the body. Now, these are isothiocyanates. They're also known as glucosinolates in kale, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, collard greens, and chard.
All the most popular vegetables that are, selected for us to eat.
Right. So this gets into the sulforaphane story, which is really cool and quite an interesting story. So I'll try and clear this up for people. So everyone knows Rhonda Patrick. I respect her work. She's super smart, and I disagree with her 100% on sulforaphane and its benefits for humans. So sulforaphane is a type of glucosinolate that is found in broccoli sprouts. Now, the reason people eat broccoli sprouts is because the amount of the sulforaphane precursor, which is called glucoraphanin, is the highest in broccoli sprouts. So there is an interesting parallel here, and I should bring it back to cassava as well. So there's an interesting concept that in many of these plants, cassava and brassica vegetables, there are two compounds. There's a precursor compound to the active compound found in the plant. So I wrote it down yesterday. I got to look at the notes real quick for the name of this. Yes. But in cassava, the precursor to the cyanogenic glycoside is called linamarin, and linamarin combines with linamarinase, linamarinase, to form hydrocyanic acid or hydrocyanic molecules. Now, so what you have is linamarin is the cyanogenic glycoside. It's activated when the plant is crushed. The same thing happens in broccoli. There is glucoraphanin and enzyme myrosinase. And when the plant is crushed or chewed, this is the plant's defense mechanism. The hydrocyanic acid or the sulforaphane are the end product when the plant is chewed. These molecules don't exist in the plant because they would probably be too toxic for the plant from an oxidative chemistry perspective. So this has to do with the transiting of electrons. But sulforaphane is very oxidatively active, meaning sulforaphane wants to move electrons around a lot in the body. So the plants don't have sulforaphane molecule. They have glucoraphanin. So the enzyme myrosinase also exists in the broccoli, and the defense mechanism is, we see this in many plants. You chew me, this enzyme is going to get this, it's going to act on this compound, and it's going to make this toxic thing, okay? So that is a really interesting parallel between cassava and brassica vegetables. In the case of cassava, the cyanogenic glycoside linamarin goes through linamarase to make hydrocyanic acid. In broccoli and brassica vegetables, you get glucoraphanin, which is transformed by myrosinase into sulforaphane. Now, the prevailing wisdom is that sulforaphane is going to cure cancer and make you live forever. In fact, I would argue sulforaphane is just going to give you hypothyroidism and probably create more oxidative stress than you need. Sulforaphane is the plant's defense molecule. Sulforaphane is what happens when something chews a brassica vegetable. The sulforaphane gets released. Now, why do we think sulforaphane is good for us? And then I'll tell you why it's bad for us. We think sulforaphane is good for us because it has been shown in some studies to decrease DNA damage. The way they look at DNA damage is by assaying a molecule called 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a measure of DNA damage. Now, the misunderstanding here is that sulforaphane, the misconception is that sulforaphane is doing that directly. Sulforaphane does not do that. Sulforaphane is poorly absorbed in the human body, and what is absorbed gets instantly detoxified by phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. So when your body sees sulforaphane, it immediately detoxifies it and excretes it through I think it's the mercapto pathway in the liver. One of the mercapto it uses glutathione. It conjugates to glutathione and the mercapto pathway in the liver, and then it gets rid of it immediately, okay? So evolutionarily, you would think that if we have been eating this compound and our body wants it, we would have evolved a way to absorb it. Instead, virtually without fail, with regard to polyphenols and plant molecules, we excrete them immediately. We do not hang on to these molecules at all. We excrete them immediately and we detoxify them through the liver, right? Now, what happens in the liver? As it's going through that detoxification pathway, there's a pathway called the NRF2 pathway that gets activated. Now, NRF2 pathway downstream is increased glutathione, which is our endogenous antioxidant. And that increase in our endogenous antioxidant is what may provide some hormetic effect against DNA damage. Now, that is not a unique mechanism, would be my argument against sulforaphane. there are better ways to increase your glutathione than eating something that is a toxin.
Yeah, how about ketosis? Ketosis increases glutathione.
Ketosis, exercise, giving your body enough sleep. So what we see in carnivores is that the level of DNA damage at baseline is already really low. And this would be my argument, is that when you are just looking at DNA damage, you are looking at one metric and not looking at the health of the whole individual. I think sulforaphane is a clear net negative. There are some instances of plant compounds being hormetic with regard to some things, but you don't need glutathione to be made from sulforaphane. You can make plenty of glutathione without it. I've done micronutrient testing on myself on a carnivorous diet, and my glutathione levels were really high without any plant polyphenols. Your body is really smart, right? Now, what is the downside of sulforaphane? Well, the first part was you don't need sulforaphane to make glutathione. You can make your own. You can get plenty. You can get beta-hydroxybutyrate being connected with that, like you said, with ketosis. So it is not a unique mechanism. And I would argue that all these plant polyphenols are similar. They are non-unique mechanisms with other detrimental effects, meaning they are redundant mechanisms with detrimental effects. Resveratrol is the same way. So what is the downside to sulforaphane? The small amount of sulforaphane that gets absorbed before it gets detoxified circulates in your blood and acts as a goitrogen, meaning it competes with iodine at the thyroid for absorption. And then you can get iodine deficient at the level of the thyroid because these isothiocyanates can get absorbed into the thyroid and they inhibit the absorption of iodine. Yeah. So by eating a ton of broccoli sprouts, you may increase your glutathione a little bit, but you will probably push yourself toward hypothyroidism. I would argue, why would we do something that has a net negative for a redundant effect that is non-unique? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's play vegan's advocate here. Yet again, not sure where's devil's advocate or vegan's advocate. All right, so I mean, you were on Mark Bell's podcast recently. He did a bodybuilding show. One of the most popular bodybuilding foods, broccoli, right? I mean, you're looking at chicken, rice, and broccoli is like the bodybuilding bro diet. And you don't really see hypothyroidism being, I mean, some of them are taking thyroid hormone, but you don't really see a lot of this stuff in the bodybuilding community. So, I mean, what do you think about that? Just as like maybe a Lane Norton style response. Well, then all bodybuilders would be hypothyroid, so therefore you're wrong.
So what's interesting about this is that when you cook broccoli, it degrades myrosinase. So cooked broccoli does not have any sulforaphane, which is why people eat raw broccoli sprouts. If the bodybuilders were all eating raw broccoli sprouts, I would argue we would probably see more hypothyroidism. And I would see that on their thyroid labs. Cooked broccoli denatures myrosinase. So basically the glucosinolate is less toxic. But when you cook broccoli, it's like, what's the point, right? Like there are other things in the broccoli that are probably not beneficial. You can cook the active compounds out of broccoli and detoxify it.
Yep.
But then you're thinking, all right, what is the benefit of eating broccoli?
Well, what's the point, right? It's like, what am I going to make a whole meal out of this? Right?
Yeah,
it's like maybe it's a few pieces of broccoli, but then you've got eggs, you've got some, some steak or something. Maybe that's, a little bit more digestible. But if you're just doing a meal of
you basically at that point you're just getting fiber, and
people think that's good.
Or maybe there are some micronutrients, and then the question is, all of it going to get denatured? Maybe there's some other stuff in there.
How much of it is even going to be absorbed? Right.
Exactly.
I guess broccoli is one of the safer ones on paper as far as oxalate goes, as far as other anti-nutrients. Right. I mean, it's nowhere near the level of sorrel, spinach, was it chard or Swiss? Right. Those are very high oxalate. So broccoli's a little bit more human friendly there, but it just seems like none of these plants. Yeah. I mean, is there a single plant that you could just live off of? You just live off of this plant? No, but there's the cow you can just live off of. Any ruminant, you can live exclusively off
elk. You can just live off an elk plant.
Beyond burger trees.
Shit. So it's crazy. I mean, you see, so this is, this is the theme that we see with regard to plants and plant compounds. We don't have a time to go into all the polyphenols.
Well, I would love to hit on that, right? Because, you're not getting sirtuins, polyphenols, antioxidants, bioflavonoids. These are the most important compounds in the body. Why aren't those not such a big deal? Why might we not have to worry about these, doctor?
So this is interesting. So so my overall thesis on plant polyphenols would be they are all this is pretty much the case exclusively, they are all poorly absorbed. Curcumin, poorly absorbed, meaning your body doesn't want these polyphenols, whether they are elagitannins from pomegranate and raspberries, whether they are curcumin, whether they are resveratrol, whether they are sulforaphane. Your body doesn't want these. They are poorly absorbed and immediately detoxified. Evolutionarily, I would argue that if our body wanted to use these, or if we use these in our biochemistry, we would absorb them and use them like we do with minerals like magnesium, zinc, copper, or vitamins A, thiamine, niacin. We absorb those and incorporate those into human biochemistry. The plant molecules, we say, I don't absorb much of that. And if a little bit gets through, I'm going to send it through the liver and detoxify it and get rid of it. Plant molecules do not participate in human biochemistry. That is fact. Anyone who thinks that plant molecules directly participate in biochemistry in humans or directly act as antioxidants is a little bit misled. So with regard to resveratrol, which is connected with the sirtuin gene system, I would say the theory, the sort of the overarching thesis is the same as sulforaphane. It is a non-unique effect that we can get through other healthy states of human existence, like ketosis, without the negative side effects from the toxin in the plant. So resveratrol is a molecule that plants use. I believe it's a pigment in the plants. And it's been studied extensively now. David Sinclair went on Joe Rogan talking about this. But this molecule has been studied as an activator of the sirtuin gene system. The sirtuin gene system is a little complex, but I'll try to break it down a little bit. So basically, it is a family of genes that have been shown to be activated by caloric restriction, and whose activation correlates with longevity in mice and yeast and worms and many organisms that it's been studied in. So when the sirtuins are activated, they generally do good things in animals. There's a very well-known study that was published a few years ago where they took mice and they had one set of mice that ate normally and one set of mice they fed a high soybean oil diet to. So they fed the mice 60% soybean oil, right? Sounds like enough to give anybody metabolic syndrome. Like you're giving somebody a ton of oxidized omega-6. You're giving them, but basically that is how they make the mice, or maybe mice or rats, I forget. That's how they make the rodents diabetic and give them fatty liver. And in those animals who they fed a 60% soybean oil diet to, they gave them resveratrol in some pretty high doses, and they were able to normalize the rat's physiology back to the normal level, okay? So, and that was probably through the activation of the sirtuin gene system. So that's interesting. People say, oh my God, this is great. I can eat my hamburger, I can eat my Cheetos, and just take some resveratrol, and I'll be as healthy as the other guy. So it's the whole attitude's a little weird, right? Like, I don't know if there have been any studies that show benefit of resveratrol in otherwise healthy animals, but there's this one study that shows normalization of an unhealthy population of animals who are fed high amounts of soybean oil back to normal. And it's through the activation of the sirtuin gene family. Sirtuins are NAD-dependent enzymes, which is why there's this whole thing about NAD and NMN right now. So, and NR. So there's nicotinamide riboside, there's NMN. These are precursors to NAD. So when
you're looking at redox potential when you're looking at NAD.
Yes, you are. And sirtuins are a deacetylase family of enzymes. They act as deacetylases, meaning they turn other genes on. And they turn on genes involved in insulin sensitivity and anti-inflammatory mechanisms, essentially. They turn on genes like the FOXO series of genes. People may have heard of that, FOXO. There's FOXO3, which has been talked about anyway. So they turn on a series of genes. And in the process of doing that, the sirtuins use up NAD, which must be recycled in the body, and then more NAD comes back to keep the sirtuins going. So the idea is that people are trying to hack the system by taking NMN and NR. NR is nicotinamide riboside, which are precursors to NAD. They are trying to hack millions of years of biology by taking a molecule. Now, the great irony for me in this is that, as you mentioned, the process of ketosis does all of the same things. So when you are in ketosis and you have beta hydroxybutyrate in your body, because you are not doing glycolysis, your NAD levels are high.
Yep.
you are getting NAD from ketosis.
It's the ratio, right? The ratio of NAD to NAD positive.
Yeah,
Or NADH.
NAD to NADH. Yeah. And so the state of ketosis with levels of beta hydroxybutyrate mimics sirtuin gene activation through exogenous resveratrol. So you can do all of this naturally as a human would have done without this exogenous molecule. This is not a unique mechanism.
Well, you mentioned butyrate too. I mean, a lot of people are talking about, the short chain fatty acids. We need to be fermenting these materials to create these fatty acids in the gut. Well, butyrate, beta hydroxybutyrate, is the main ketone body that's flowing all throughout our entire body when you're fasting or on a carnivore or ketogenic diet. So you're going to have loads of butyrate in your body also.
And beta hydroxybutyrate can be used as fuel by the colonic enterocytes. And so you don't need butyrate. I talked about this with Lane on the podcast. You don't need butyrate for your colonic epithelial cells to be healthy. You can make other short chain fatty acids from amino acids, namely propionate or isobutyrate, and your body can use ketones directly to feed the epithelial cells in the gut. The whole equation is just so cool, man.
And
the idea
also, what about, all right, so gut bacteria. There are gut bacteria that break down amino acids. There are gut bacteria that break down fatty acids as well. It's not just fiber. So I mean, people are so obsessed with the gut bacteria. I think maybe this would be a good segue, and then we've been going for a while, man. Me and you, we could go for hours. We'll have to do this again soon. Let's what about gut bacteria balance, gut microbiota dysfunction, good bacteria, bad bacteria? You lose the good bacteria, you're going to get the bad bacteria that eat the naughty animal foods. This is another one of the arguments against carnivorous diets. I obviously think it's silly and fallacious, but what about you, Dr. Paul Saladino?
I agree with you, man. I think this is so interesting. And the cool thing about this one is that companies like Ubiome and Viome are allowing me to have some really good data to prevent people from propagating this myth any longer. So I actually put out on my Instagram just yesterday and asking people in the carnivore community to send me their Ubiome and Viomes. And what I got were a number of those that showed really high levels of alpha diversity, which is the first thing we look for. So let me just make the caveat that we really don't understand the gut microbiome very well. But what we see in the microbiome of carnivorous humans that I have seen in people in the community is that they have alpha diversity, meaning a variety of species in the gut that is better than most people on mixed diets. So if people are familiar with, I believe it was Ubiome, if people are familiar with Ubiome, they give an alpha diversity score in the beginning. And one of the ones I got yesterday was an alpha diversity score of 8.29. I'll pull it up. 8.29 was this alpha diversity score that I got.
Is that out of 10?
Out of 10. Out of 10. So I'll pull it up and I'll give you the reference range.
They call it alpha diversity.
Alpha diversity. And alpha diversity just means it's just a sort of what is it? It's an ecological term that talks about the number of different species in a certain area, right? So someone sent me their, this is just the diversity score from Ubiome, and it was 8.9 out of 10. Most people have diversity scores between 6 and 9. Hers was 8.29 out of 10, which is probably in the upper fifth quintile. She also had what you see in these samples also is that people have all the bacteria that are normally represented, and they have good diversity. They have all the species that are normally represented. And this person sent me their Ubiome. It was so interesting. Or somebody else sent me his. He actually had, this is a whole other rabbit hole, which we maybe don't want to go down. He had almost undetectable levels of TMAO producing bacteria in his gut. Which is, the TMAO. So he's a carnivore, and he doesn't even have any bacteria that make TMAO, which is so interesting. TMAO thing is just a whole rabbit hole. I don't think it's really been fully fleshed out. But what you see in carnivores, and I've tested my own gut flora twice through a GI map test while I've been doing this diet, you see all of the populations are still represented. The idea that you need carbohydrates, the idea that you need fiber to feed a healthy microbiome is unsupported by science. And what we are increasingly seeing is that, whoa, like you said, there are bacteria that can metabolize fatty acids. There are bacteria that can metabolize protein. We don't need or even benefit from fiber or carbohydrates for our microbiome. You can make the opposite argument, in fact. And it's crazy to look at carnivorous microbiomes in humans. They look really good as far as we can tell. And I will tell you clinically, and I'm sure you are familiar with this phenomenon, that almost unanimously, people on carnivorous diets without carbohydrates and without protein report significant improvement in symptoms and GI symptoms.
But it doesn't count. The other side will say, oh, well, no, it doesn't count because you can't eat beans without farting, right? Like, you got to be able to eat the soy and the flax and all this stuff without farting again. It's so insane. Like, you can show somebody who's clinically resolved, like, every single symptom of their Crohn's disease, of their IBS. But no, it still doesn't count, dude, because maybe you need that Oxalobacter formigenes and you need to eat oxalates again. It's the mentality. It's very hard to crack sometimes. But hey, the people who are really sick, the people who are really searching for health, they end up figuring this stuff out because they.
I think they do, and I think that's what's really cool is that a lot of people who are sick and not doing good and who are searching end up, in carnivorous circles, and they end up watching things like this, and hopefully it's helpful to them. And by and large, people that try to eat this way feel really good. I mean, I did a video on my YouTube channel about a couple of pitfalls in carnivore, and definitely it's not an easy transition for some people. Some people get loose stool, some people get constipated. So the GI transition to a carnivorous diet is a little tricky, but in general, people feel pretty darn good. So yeah, it's a wild thing.
All right, so we got some people with some super chats. We got Yin Yang says, hello, how are you? I'm good. Dr. Saladino, how are you?
I'm good, man.
Okay, he's good. So the only produce I can somewhat tolerate are pears, apples, coconut, carrots, and squash. Are they low oxalate foods? I think all of those are actually pretty low in oxalate, even squash. What do you? Yeah. Are any of those high oxalate? Those?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Pears, apples. No, I don't think so. I mean,
pears, apples, coconut. Coconut has salicylate, so if you're sensitive to that, that's what's going to be coconut. Yeah. I know carrots are pretty low in oxalate, and so is squash, I think.
Squash, I think, is pretty low, yeah.
It sounds like you figured out that you're sensitive to oxalate, my friend. That's kind of what it sounded like to me there. Let's see if there's any other super chats here. If you guys have any questions for Dr. Paul Saladino or myself, you can throw them in there. Or else we're probably going to start wrapping this up. Someone says, Tristan, why don't you play RuneScape any longer? Dude, I don't even know what RuneScape is. What is RuneScape? I used to play Roller Coaster Tycoon. That was my game when I was... And then Halo. Once those came out, I used to play those games. All right. What's the best human diet? Of course, we can eat anything, but what promotes life and what promotes health? I mean, that's a broad question. Dr. Saladino, what do you think? What's the best human diet?
I mean, I think that if you listen to the last 2 hours of this podcast,
yeah, like, hey, what doesn't make you bleed from your butt when you eat it?
Yeah. I mean, I would say my opinion is that it is a carnivorous diet. Now, one of the things we did not talk about in this podcast that people can see at my social media is that I believe in eating nose to tail, kind of like we were talking about. I do not think of a carnivorous diet as a meat-only diet. I think of it as meat and connective tissue and animal organs and animal fat and animal bones and omega-3s from fish. You need a calcium source, you need an omega-3 source, you need a fat source, you need a muscle meat source, you need a connective tissue source. You have to get all those things. I would say that is the optimal human diet in terms of nutrient density and lack of toxins. And I would say try that and tell me how much ass you kick.
All right, there you go. I guess we're going to wrap it up now. I don't see any more questions over here in the super chat section. Dr. Paul Saladino, where can people find you? Where can people find more of your work?
So I am on YouTube. I have a channel. You can search Paul Saladino MD. I do videos there. I have a Patreon now. It's under Paul Saladino MD. And so if people want to support my work, they can get on my Patreon. And through the Patreon, I'm going to offer people the ability to vote on which videos I do on YouTube. And I'm going to do some live chats for people on the Patreon. I'm also on Instagram at Paul Saladino MD. I am on Twitter at MD Saladino. And last name is spelled Saladino. I have a website, which is paulsaladinomd.com. As I mentioned in the beginning, I am a practicing physician. I see clients privately. If people want to work with me, they can email me. The email is paulsaladinomd@gmail.com. And I am available for speaking engagements, world tours, rock concerts, dance parties,
Ooh, private dance
birthday parties, whatever.
Bachelorette parties.
I'll be, I'm in Seattle now. I'll be moving to San Diego in June.
Where in San Diego?
Probably Encinitas.
Encinitas, dude.
Do some surfing and build a private practice down there. I am in the process of writing a book, which will probably happen over the next few months. I am working with the guys over at MentorBox. So I also recently recorded some lessons for MentorBox, which is a pretty cool company out of Southern California. And people can check out my lessons there as well. So look for the book. Probably going to be about maybe 5-6 months for the book. I got a little work to do on that. But the book will be coming out about carnivorous diets and evolution and how to do it. And those are all my outlets. So people can follow me there and reach out to me, and we will continue to spread the good word.
Awesome. So I'll in the pinned comment on this video, I'll put a link to Dr. Paul Saladino's YouTube channel, and you can use that as a hub to jump off and find some more of the stuff very easily off of this video. So yeah, man, I'm excited for you. Congratulations on the big move. I actually grew up in Carlsbad, down right next to Encinitas. Yeah, so
yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on, dude. It's a pleasure.
Dude, there's a good skate park in Encinitas now. I know you're into skateboarding a little bit.
I skate a little bit. Yeah, I haven't skated in a while, but I like the surfing now.
They built a crazy plaza, a little skate plaza there, and it's got all kinds of cool stuff. So I'm jealous of you, my friend. Paul Saladino, thanks for coming on, man. I'll see you next time. Will you come on the show again?
Of course, my brother.
Whew! It's coming on again, guys. So it's been a long discussion. Paul Saladino, MD. Thanks for coming on, my friend. Everybody watching, thanks for hanging out. We got a bunch of people in the chat still. 298 people still left after this long outro. Thanks for hanging out, guys. You can find more at primaledgehealth.com. The Carnivore Cookbook, we in the next couple weeks, we're going to have some major announcements concerning the Carnivore Cookbook. So
I'm excited about that.
Yeah, man. Y'all, I'll get you a copy as soon as I can. I'll have to get your address after this. So
yeah, for sure.
Peace out, guys. All you meatheads out there, all you meat tards out there, as John Joseph called us. I'll see you guys next time.